Diane, it's 6:31 a.m. I've just woken up from a strange and terrifying dream. In this dream, Diane, I had the sense that I was nothing but a moving picture, made of millions and millions of little squares, like atoms, but a picture with no control over its own movements. I was a mind inside another mind, which at once shared my hopes and fears, and moved my limbs in rhythm with our likeness. At the same time, I lived another life, on another plane of existence, and somebody moved me in ways I couldn't understand. I don't know how to describe this feeling to you, Diane. It's like indigestion. I stood up to open the curtain, and I looked outside. There, in the parking lot, I saw myself. He had his back to me, but I knew who he was. He was made up of so many little squares, Diane. Are we all made of squares? I looked down, and on the windowsill, I saw this strange device with colourful buttons in all sorts of shapes, which looked somehow like it had been made to fit perfectly into the shape of my hands. Each colourful button I pulled or pressed jolted me into motion. And looking at myself, stopping and starting out there on the asphalt, I wondered if he felt how I had in my dream. Diane, remind me to stop drinking milk before bed.
Welcome to the first Game Assist podcast, maybe of many, maybe of none, maybe first of one. Today, we're going to discuss David Lynch and his impact on video games. And we're going to be talking about his work, some of the common themes that come up, and a lot of the games that we think are kind of closely associated with Lynch, other maybe been inspired by, or been inspired by stuff that is inspired by. We'll get into it today. So I thought it'd be a good idea for us to maybe introduce ourselves and chat a little bit about maybe some of the stuff we've watched, maybe some of our impressions of Lynch. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah, pronouns they, she, and today I'm Special Agent Dale Cooper, not to be representing the FBI, but we'll get into that today. I got super into David Lynch quite recently, over the last kind of year or so. Actually, I watched Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, and I didn't super vibe with Lynch at that time, which is something that I do want to talk about later. And that my route into that actually was Life is Strange, because Life is Strange is super influenced by, in particular, Twin Peaks. And then last year, a friend really wanted to watch Mulholland Drive with me, and I completely fell in love with it. I thought it was one of the most incredible movies I've ever seen. And yeah, strangely, a few months later, David Lynch passed away. And it just kind of over that time started getting really into Lynch. And I've seen Twin Peaks, and I've seen, I think, all of his feature films. I've also seen some of his short films, his early experimental work. As you're probably getting from this, it became something of a hyperfixation.
Hello, fear, they, them. I don't know where to look I'm into the camera or not, because I hate it in movies when people do that, and it's like, that's not how that works, so I'm going to not do that unless it's for a funny bit. Then I'll do it, but right now I'm not, because it's like making eye contact. My first introduction to Lynch was very indirect, in the sense that I was in sixth form, I was doing film studies, and a friend of mine said, "You look like David Lynch," because I had a short hair and a coif, whatever that hairstyle is called at the time. I didn't. I just had the same hairstyle, and I was like, okay. And then I didn't watch any of his films until this year, basically. So that was like 10 years ago. And yeah, my first actual experience with his work was Twin Peaks, which was like in 2023. Because like, right, I think I got to do this because it inspired a bunch of things that I like, which obviously we're going to talk about. And then this year I have kind of watched the big hits. For the most part, there's a few that are missing from my filmography, but I know that come my Letterboxd Wrapped, he's probably going to be my most watched director.
Yeah, I'm Charlotte, pronoun she, her. I actually first, I think, experienced anything Lynch weirdly on a date with someone, and she was talking about, this was like, God. Yes, it's probably about 10 years ago now. And I think we both got talking about Twin Peaks, and I think I'd seen some, like... Basically, it was when I was still on Tumblr, and I'd seen some, like, gift sets of Audrey Horne slaying, and I was like, this seems like a vibe to me. And we got talking about it on a date, and we ended up, like, watching the first few episodes together. And I finished... We didn't continue dating, it was kind of just not the vibe, but... I finished the first season and was like, oh, I'm super into this. I love it. This is kind of weird, but I'm really into it. And then I think I probably got like maybe into the first 2 episodes of the second season, and just it became, at the time, for 21-year-old Charlotte, just a little bit too weird for me. And I just couldn't quite get on board with it, I guess. I think it was all the stuff about giants. I think I just kind of checked out. Then me and my partner watched Lynch's Dune several years ago, which obviously is not his best work.
Oh, controversial.
I don't know, is that controversial?
So I think you're going to be the controversial one here.
Okay, well, I had a great fun camp time, but I don't know that it would line up with some of...
Oh,
okay,
we don't have
the time
to get...
It's a departure from his other work. I wouldn't say it's good or bad.
We don't have the time to get into all of the like Dune lore today, but I'm a defender of David Lynch's Dune. I wouldn't say it's his like best work or my favorite film, but I really, really like it.
It's a fun, silly time, and I respect it for that. But yeah, until more recently, obviously he died earlier this year in January, which I didn't actually realise it was that recent. Like, for some reason in my head it was like actually ages ago. Or like a year ago at least. And yeah, we'd kind of been talking quite a lot about his work and his legacy, like his game assist, and obviously his impact on some of our favourite video games. And we kind of decided to do this podcast, and I was like, okay, it's time to lock in. And lock in I did. And now I've watched all of Twin Peaks and Fire Walk With Me in The Return, and I have watched Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway. There we go. For a second I was like, which one was it? So yeah, there's a couple of his films and a solid chunk of Twin Peaks. So yeah. Yeah, that's where I'm at coming into this. And obviously, yeah, we will get into the games.
Like, for people who are familiar with our channel, you know that kind of what we do is we try to engage with video games like in a political way. And so a lot of what we kind of are intending to do today is not just to talk about Lynch's influence on video games, but to kind of offer a bit more of a political analysis of it. Yeah, just to kind of bring that in.
So I think our first kind of theme was around like politics of Americana and suburban Gothic, and Lynch's critique or not critique of American suburbia. And that obviously does come into quite a lot of the games as well.
I guess that It might be interesting to define suburban Gothic. That's not necessarily a term I'm super familiar with, so I'd be happy to hand that off to anyone who's kind of like more kind of well versed with that term. But I guess that it's a great theme to start with, because I think that what David Lynch is kind of, I feel like when people talk about David Lynch in pop culture, it's always this, right? It's always American dreams and American nightmares, the dark underbelly of the American dream, you know, like that's how people talk about David Lynch. So I think in a lot of ways it's like a really interesting one to start with. But yeah, I guess it might be worth talking about what Americana means and what suburban Gothic means.
So I've got sorry, I was just going to say I've got a Google definition of suburban Gothic if we want to hear it, just for some very loose context. Suburban Gothic is a subgenre of Gothic fiction, art, film and television focused on anxieties associated with the creation of suburban communities, particularly in the United States and the Western world from the 1950s and 60s onwards. That is the Wikipedia definition, actually. Sorry, not Google. I won't credit Google. But yeah, so it's often not necessarily what we would consider as classic Gothic, but it has Gothic themes in terms of the kind of, reflections of anxieties, of social anxieties upon communities in the general zeitgeist.
Interesting one, because I feel like that is a thing that is not really found much in a lot of games inspired by Lynch. I would say like the closest one is probably Alan Wake and Alan Wake 2, because it's the only one, despite not necessarily being set in like a suburban area, it's more of like a lakeside, mountainy kind of, you know, foresty area. That feels like the closest one that there is to this idea of the suburbs. I think it has a similar kind of, it translates to a place that you might view as safe or comfortable, and that like it's like a, you know, a getaway kind of destination, and where the suburbs aren't. But again, it's the kind of town where these things don't happen, you know.
Yeah. So a couple of examples of films, for instance. Oops, sorry, I've just ruined my own camera thing there. There we go. A couple of examples of films include Nightmare on Elm Street, David Lynch's Blue Velvet, Rebel Without a Cause, Virgin Suicides, I'm trying to read, The Lovely Bones, and Donnie Darko's a pretty kind of classic example of it as well. So if that kind of helps with an understanding of that, like, the things shouldn't happen here, I think very much does exemplify what it's about. And it's also this kind of, I think, critique on suburbia and how it functions within capitalism, and the fact that we had all these kind of basically cities formed around industry, right? And, you know, you had the bases of all these industries kind of starting in particular cities, and then communities were created by capitalism. So you have a lot of places where, like, you know, we've talked a bit before about like mining towns and things like that. You kind of have entire communities formed around work. And that's kind of what suburbs initially were conceived as. It's like people can commute into work from these places into the city. And there's something in there about capitalism and capitalist critique, as well as a kind of understanding of how we've created these communities to be these safe environments for middle-class white people, basically. And that puts people in a kind of state of, oh, well, nothing bad can happen here, when actually a lot of the time bad things very much do happen in those places, and they are created upon a kind of violence.
Yes, yeah. Those communities where like a certain group of people is, you know, supposed to be guaranteed safety. That's actually kind of like their very existence is predicated on like violence against like other people. I think Blue Velvet is definitely the first thing that came to mind in terms of like a Lynch film, and I think that it is probably, it's funny because it's the only one that I can actually think of that is suburban, because I think that the kind of vibe in Blue Velvet is that it is on the outskirts of a city, right? Because part of the kind of, encounter that Jeffrey has with kind of like darkness or the seedy underbelly of America entails him going into the city from his kind of like white picket fence suburban area to this kind of like, you know, dark apartment building, like which in kind of a more urbanized area where Dorothy lives. I actually don't know how much of his other work is like necessarily super suburban, because when you were mentioning Alan Wake, I was thinking, well, the town in Alan Wake, Bright Falls, is like super obviously based on Twin Peaks, and Twin Peaks I don't think you could describe as a suburban area necessarily. It's more of a,
I think,
I disagree with that slightly.
Yeah, I mean, so the Wikipedia article does actually directly reference both Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me as examples of the genre. And it says that the works of David Lynch are seen as defining examples to the genre. I think it's kind of the implication of what suburban means to us, because I think in a lot of, maybe in the context of the UK, like we have quite defined cities, right? Like we don't have, our towns and cities are very like defined and clear of like what's a town, what's a city, all of these things, whereas I don't know if it's the same in America. But I think
I guess
also,
well, I guess that, sorry, I guess based on your definition, I thought of it as like being an area like on the outskirts of a city. I think that it like, I mean, I haven't lived in the United States, but I lived in Canada for a while, and I do think because like the North America is like, it's these vast open spaces, right? There's definitely like a sense in which like a city, as opposed to kind of the outskirts of the city, the suburbs, and then further beyond that, kind of like towns with like hundreds of miles between them, is kind of like there's so much space between these areas because it's such a just enormous country. But I guess like, you know, potentially my mistake, but is what we understand suburbia to be like those areas just outside the city, or can that like mean towns like Twin Peaks, which I don't think, like, I guess Twin Peaks is like quote unquote close to Seattle in the American sense, which is that it's like, you know, actually quite far from Seattle, but that's like a city that we hear about sometimes in Twin Peaks, but we never really like see. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I would have thought of that more as like rural, but I guess that, you know, those things might be, yeah, connected. I don't know.
Well, I think based on just like, sorry, just quickly, just on in terms of the definition and kind of, I guess it's connection to capitalism in terms of like towns that have been created as a result of work, and I did use like mining towns as like an example of that. Twin Peaks is a logging town, you know, like it's structured around this one big industry, and everything else is kind of there because people might go and visit it for its scenery or whatever, but it is mainly, you know, a town formed around a profession. So I think that also kind of comes under suburbia in this idea again of these kind of created towns around workplaces. So yeah, sorry, Fear, you can.
Well, I was also going to say, I think in terms of like, I think Twin Peaks still works in terms of that aesthetic representation of a suburb, because it when I think about Laura Palmer's house, for example, like that is what I'm envisioning as a suburb to look like. It's again like, you know, the beautiful house, you know, like all kind of segregated by. There's an interesting thing in Mother 3, because I played that for the first time earlier this year, where it starts out where the town like is there's no capitalism, there's no money, everyone just like takes anything they want, and it's very communal. And then when currency and capitalism is introduced to this society, very, very small community, all the houses literally become separated. And I like, it's a real indictment of how we are physically separated and the community is robbed from us through the introduction of a system like capitalism. And so I think that it, like, even if it's not literally a suburb, because maybe there isn't a direct connection to an urban area, there is still the same kind of principles in effect within Twin Peaks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure it does. I think, I guess as you were talking a bit about the towns that are created and kind of like rise around like certain kinds of blue collar work, I was thinking of Life is Strange, particularly True Colors. Life is Strange True Colors is kind of like a lot of it has to do with that, you know, like what's it called, Haven Springs being like this it's a mining town, right? And so a lot of that game is a lot of the kind of conflict in that game is like a direct result of the mining company and its kind of like exploits trying to kind of like exploit kind of the citizens of True Colors, which is interesting because like in some ways True Colors is like aesthetically or stylistically arguably not as Lynchian as like the installments that were made by the Don't Nod team, who, you know, like a lot of the people who kind of worked on Life is Strange 1, Life is Strange 2, that team at Don't Nod Studios, they are, you know, very influenced by Lynch. They love him. They post about him on social media all the time. And you can see that in kind of like, I think a lot of the surrealist pieces that you get, you know, like in Life is Strange episode 5, or like some of the kind of more dreamy sequences in those games. True Colors, whereas I guess True Colors kind of has that, but I always kind of felt like it was slightly ripping off the first game when it did that kind of dream sequence in episode 5.
It doesn't feel as thematically meaningful. I think the more dream sequence in True Colors does feel a lot more like it is giving us story beats we didn't get before, rather than necessarily reflecting on what has happened so far and like the impact of what's happened so far, I guess, which is what I feel like Life is Strange 1 does very well, in that it kind of just sits in that for a bit and reflects a lot of all the different themes and like story plots that have happened throughout the game. It kind of reflects them all and forces us to sit in them a bit. In this, during a, you know, in real time, obviously Max is like literally trapped in the dark room, you know, so we kind of have this like real time versus like dream time thing, whereas in True Colors we don't really have that same split. I guess it's very much just like Alex gets shot down a mine shaft and, you know, is kind of nearly dying, but this whole thing is sort of happening in real time as she like remembers some of these things from her past that we didn't actually get to learn before, or we got very lightly hinted at.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just like, I feel like the dream bit is like, in True Colors, is kind of trying to give you that backstory about her life, as opposed to the one in Life is Strange 1, which is, it's just fucking weird, and it gives you more context about Max as a person, but it's not like, here's some backstory.
Yeah, it doesn't tell us anything we didn't already have.
And it's like, I guess it's in True Colors, it's just not as weird.
Yeah. It's very realistic, because you know, you get these like specific scenes that Alex has lived through of her childhood, right? You get these very specific like snapshots of those times. They're not really altered, apart from there's some interesting stuff with like sound and things, but it doesn't and like memory, but it doesn't it feels quite literal rather than metaphorical in the way that Lynch often does, and also Life is Strange 1 did, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I remember, you know how like I guess like Life is Strange 1 as well, in terms of like how it has that Lynchian vibe, and then we could probably kind of talk more, it might be worth talking more broadly about the like Twin Peaks inspired games and how they kind of do it differently. Like Life is Strange opens with Max in a dream. And so in a lot of ways it's like, yeah, I feel like dreams and the kind of dreamlike feeling that game has, it just does it really well. I don't know. It's almost like the whole game is a dream, even the parts that feel real. I just think that they accomplish that so well. And it's I guess like it could be a good time to bring up Alan Wake soon as well, because when I was recently playing Alan Wake for the first time, he has that dream about going to the lighthouse, and I was like, oh my god, this is so Life is Strange, because that's literally what happens at the beginning of Life is Strange. Is she's waking up in the dream and she's like, I need to go to the lighthouse. I'll be safe if I can make it there. And that's also like the great dream logic stuff of like she just wakes up and she just knows she needs to go to the lighthouse.
She knows her goal. You don't know why she knows her goal, and she doesn't know why she knows her goal, but she knows what it is, and she has to follow it. Yeah, for sure.
And I guess like, well, I guess in terms of thinking about the politics of Twin Peaks and maybe kind of the games that are inspired by Twin Peaks to kind of frame it, I think that, yeah, of course, in a big way, it kind of like explores the dark side of this community, right? And all of the like dark secrets that people have. I think that, but that's like first and foremost done through the murder of Laura Palmer and how she is this like beloved young girl to her community, and initially you have this idea of her as basically like the perfect like American girl, homecoming queen, like all of that, and then you kind of slowly start to realize how miserable and how like troubled and how traumatized she really was, and then of course spoilers for Twin Peaks.
I mean, I think we can comfortably do a little spoiler warning,
and also
before.
like everything that we're going to talk about, spoilers. That, you know, the person who did this was her father, which in a lot of ways is kind of like the most chilling indictment of kind of like the American nuclear family. But it's also about how everyone in that community was kind of complicit, because, you know, that scene where Bobby at the funeral, one right thing that Bobby ever said, but he
got that one thing.
He's the worst person you know did one thing right. So in a lot of ways that feels like how Twin Peaks approaches that theme. We can kind of get into it more in the propaganda section, but like in terms of what is, you know, how it does it well, how it does it badly. I think all of the stuff about Laura Palmer and that kind of critique of the American nuclear family in a lot of ways is so affecting and so personal and like so resonant, but then you kind of have this wider romanticization of like institutions like the FBI or the police, and those things are somewhat in tension. So I guess maybe that kind of gives us a bit of framing to start with when we talk about these games.
Definitely. I think in terms of like the kind of, I think that some of the propaganda stuff will also tie into the kind of like obsession with Americana, but yeah, obviously a huge theme of a lot of Lynch's work is nostalgia and that kind of romanticization of nostalgia or playing around with nostalgia. And obviously he's heavily influenced by a lot of classic cinema, but also, you know, he's got a very like 50s aesthetic, or he had a very 50s aesthetic himself with his quiff and everything. And, you know, the kind of, I guess there's a lot, especially in Twin Peaks, about like the kind of more twee aspects, I guess, of this small town, like the diner and the milkshakes and the cherry pie and the diner coffee, and like that's very much part of that, I guess, obsession with Americana and like all these symbols and not necessarily brands exactly, but like products, I guess. You know, you kind of get this very, I think a lot of people, especially before I watched Twin Peaks, like I still knew about like the obsession with coffee and like, you know, the cherry pie and like that kind of stuff. I really had internalized a lot of that in my knowledge of it, and I think that whole aesthetic is such a huge part of his work in general, and that kind of romanticization of America and Americana.
It is both Twin Peaks' kind of biggest asset and also it's one of its biggest flaws, right? Where like it makes you feel very endeared. I guess we'll kind of have to talk a little bit about propaganda here as well, because we are technically viewing Twin Peaks through the lens of Special Agent Dale Cooper, who we have on the show with us here today, through the embodiment of Sarah. and he's obviously not the first character we're introduced to, but he's kind of the main vehicle to it through which we get to know the town, and through which we fall in love with the town ourselves, because that's what he does steadily over the course of the original 2 seasons. He falls in love with the smell of the trees, like you say, the pie and the coffee, and, you know, classic line, that's a damn good cup of coffee. And there's not really enough like self-examination of those things. And I think there's a kind of funny thing, like an almost replication of that in Alan Wake, where I was thinking about the original Alan Wake, because I do think 2 is a lot more self-reflective of Alan Wake as a character, the original Alan Wake as a game, Remedy's own history as a game studio. It's quite a metatextual game. But with the original Alan Wake, it feels so of its time for a majority of it, because it was like early 2010s. And then I was so surprised by one particular line, and I don't think it deserves that much credit for it. But there's a bit where I think, I can't remember who it was, I think it's Alan Wake's wife. She is saying something about how he's like a straight white guy, you know, who gets everything he wants, that kind of a thing. And it took me aback, because, like, again, early 2010s video game scene where there's so much like machismo, and it's the, you know, PS3, Xbox 360 era, so pretty much every male video game character has like a shaved head because they just didn't want to do hair for whatever reason. And hard to animate, yeah, and particularly if it's a woman. And I think like the original Alan Wake doesn't quite have that same sense of self-reflection either in its politics and the thing that it's doing, in the way that like Alan Wake has an effect on the town, and it's like it's almost there. It's the roots of it are there, and ironically, again, you can kind of see, I think anyway, a reflection of that in The Return, in Twin Peaks season 3, and also in Alan Wake 2. But I think it's you know, Twin Peaks itself came out at a time where TV just wasn't like that. So it's surprising it kind of came out at all. Like, obviously, famously kind of like cancelled and came back and then cancelled again. So yeah, it's a bit of a miracle series in a way.
I'd be interested in kind of like thinking about kind of Bright Falls, the town, in a way, as its own character, because I guess I'm thinking about Life is Strange, and I'm thinking about Arcadia Bay, and how there is that kind of, I mean, nostalgia is such a huge theme in Life is Strange, right? Which again is kind of like part of what it does so well, this idea that you can never go home again. Max literally physically goes home again, but she can't like access that childhood that she lost, or the years that she lost with Chloe. And that's such a huge part of the game, is that, you know, it does, like, it is so warm and so inviting and so nostalgic, but at the same time, like, so bittersweet. And I feel like it's interesting, because sometimes there's in Life is Strange fandom, sometimes you do see kind of like a similar, like, I think I was sharing this with you on TikTok the other day, Fia, but like, you know how people like go to Snoqualmie where they filmed Twin Peaks, and they do the whole like Twin Peaks like thing. They're like, oh, I'm in Twin Peaks, and, you know, they take the photos and they post it on social media going to the RR and like blah blah blah. Some Life is Strange fans kind of started doing that with Arcadia Bay. So they go to the like location that Arcadia Bay is based on. There's a bench, which is like the bench by the lighthouse where Max and Chloe sit at the beginning and the end of the game, that very significant location, and they like graffiti on it. And so the relationship that like the fans of that game have to Arcadia Bay feels similar to the relationship that fans of Twin Peaks have with Twin Peaks. And I think it is because even though they're both like a game and a TV show that are about kind of the darkness in these towns, there is also like a goodness and a warmth and a nostalgia to these towns. And it's like sometimes I think people interpret these texts as kind of like the goodness isn't real, but I feel, when I think about like how I guess that game makes me feel, how Life is Strange makes me feel, it's very nostalgic for me as a game, and also again that sense of place is so well done. I think that again, in the same kind of way that I feel in a lot of Lynch's works, it's not that the good isn't real, it's that there's good and there's bad, and sometimes you kind of forget that the bad is there too. And in Life is Strange, it's like, okay, so I guess this is an interesting, point of like political kind of contrast, is that I guess that you could argue that Life is Strange's like critique of Arcadia Bay is a lot more politically charged and a lot more structural, because it looks at kind of like the, you know, it looks like the Prescott family and kind of the way that wealth is used in this town, the way that, you know, the fishermen are losing their jobs because of like the Prescott kind of empire, the way that the Prescotts fund the school, which of course is the site of the interpersonal violence of the art teacher kind of like kidnapping and murdering his students. And it has the somewhat more troubling representation of like Native American kind of myths, right, which is kind of similar to the, I think, objectification of Native Americans in Twin Peaks, but it is kind of still alluding to this whole thing of like, you know, capitalism fundamentally is what is the evil in a lot of ways. It's, you know, it's ruining kind of the environment. Life is Strange talks a lot about climate change. It's, you know, it's ruining the school. It's taking people's jobs. It's like, you know, the Prices are a poor family and they can't pay their medical bills in the alternate universe. So capitalism in a lot of ways is the big bad in Life is Strange. In Twin Peaks, it's like,
it's interesting.
Kind of there.
It's interesting that you say all of this, because everything you've said, I'm like, I can think of an example in Twin Peaks of something similar. Like, I guess if we think about like the Horns own quite a lot of the town, and also like this mill is owned by Josie and then Catherine,
yeah.
There we go. Sorry. Literally just been listening to podcasts about it and I still can't remember the names.
It's a big cast.
It's a big cast, you're not wrong. You know, they obviously basically due to like some nonsense between a bunch of people who want some land, the mill gets burned down, and that's like an entire industry in this town, and it's never discussed that like that means loads of people have lost their jobs. Like at no point. It's kind of like there's all this stuff under the surface that if you think about it for like more than a minute, you're like, oh my god, like the drama of this mill burning down has like ruined this town economically, I'm sure, but it means that these rich people can get richer, you know.
This is kind of it, right? It's like it's kind of there in Twin Peaks, but it never feels like it's dealt with satisfactorily. Like I've just been rewatching season 2, and the fact that Ben Horne has this weird redemption plotline is crazy to me.
After reliving the Civil War, was it like right
on the side of the Confederates, by the way.
The Confederates, yeah,
on the side of the Confederates.
Fucking hell. That's wrong.
Can you tell that Lynch and Frost weren't there for that bit?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, there does seem to be like, obviously that is the part of the series where Lynch and Frost weren't there, but a lot of the other stuff, like stuff about the mill and the kind of weird fetishization of like Hawk and his actual magical investigative abilities that are never really like, no one ever really points out that Hawk's like the only one actually doing any detective work in Twin Peaks.
So true.
Like he's literally the only one who's like actually knocking on people's doors and like checking up on shit and being like following leads, whereas Dale is literally just fucking like throwing rocks at bottles to deduce stuff, so, and having dreams. So yeah, it's there's definitely a lot going on there. Lynch and Frost are still culpable for a lot of that. I feel like I could have a lot more to say on Life is Strange, but I want to not talk about Life is Strange for a bit. So I was interested in your opinion, Fia, I guess, on like like what I was saying about like Arcadia Bay and Twin Peaks, like Bright Falls, I guess, because Bright Falls is such an important location in Alan Wake, and it's kind of meant to be like the Twin Peaks of Alan Wake in a way.
It's an interesting thing, right, where like I think, again, talking about how Alan Wake is of its era, is that sense of linearity that many games at the time had. There wasn't really so much of this like free-flowing exploration where like when you get kind of those big tentpole Sony PlayStation titles now, and this kind of applies to Alan Wake too, a lot of them will be like, when they're not open world, they are still kind of funneling you somewhere, but there's more room for exploration, and that's the case in Alan Wake too. Like, it's not just like you are going down a set path, but you can kind of wander about a bit. And the original Alan Wake, like, a little bit allows that, but it again, because of scope of the time, it's you are going in a straight line towards the end of the game for the most part. And I think that kind of hurts you in really getting to know Bright Falls in a way that you do with Twin Peaks, because I do really feel like, again, because of even just Cooper's fascination with the town, there's so many small details you learn about it and find out about it, and there's, I think, even a broader implication of there being more out there in Twin Peaks that we can't quite see. It's like just off the edges of the camera. But when you have a game setting, you are able to explore it, and when you don't really quite get to see as much of it as you might want, it makes the place feel weaker. And again, I think it's something they improved upon with the sequel, because for people's context who maybe haven't played the sequel or don't know much about it, whereas in the first one you just play as Alan Wake, and you're kind of going through Bright Falls, and everything is, it's not quite a horror game. It's like, flirting with it, but definitely not. The sequel is, but you also play as a new character called Saga Anderson, who is an FBI agent. And whereas Alan Wake is kind of trapped in this horrible dark realm, kind of in the same way that Cooper, goes into the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks, Saga is actually in Bright Falls and exploring it. And I think even just in terms of like graphical fidelity and modernity, there is just a much stronger sense of place and therefore identity that I feel is lost in the original. It kind of almost makes it harder to land as a space,
Yeah, I really feel that. I guess having played both recently, I do think it's better in the sequel, but I still kind of feel like I still kind of feel like Bright Falls doesn't really like make much of an impression in my mind or as a place.
I would agree with that.
And I think that that's a shame. And I think again, like it's interesting, I guess, talking about kind of like how technology potentially kind of like allows kind of like more scope for the exploration of a space, because I was just thinking as you were speaking that Life is Strange 2015 is like it's a game. It's one of those games where you can see how it was limited by certain technological limitations, but it uses it to its advantage to create a sense of place so well. Because there's a really limited like number of locations actually in that game, but you visit them again and again and have the kind of opportunity to explore them and the way that they change over time in such a way that even though like that game has quite like it's technologically quite limited, it just Arcadia Bay like looms large in your mind. Yeah, I guess like speaking politically of Alan Wake as well, it's like, what's the politics of Bright Falls,
Yeah, I guess that kind of crops up in the second one, because was it a mayoral election that's kind of going on in the background, right?
Oh god, yeah.
But that I don't remember that being, it's because it's been a couple of years since I've played it now. I played it when it came out, and it's more fresh in your mind. Was that something that really ever felt like it properly tied into the narrative?
No, I don't think you ever learn. Like, you see this, there's one mayoral candidate, you see his posters all over, but you never learn anything more. Like, what are his policies? Who's he running against? Like, what parties do they represent? What are the, like, issues that people of Bright Falls are facing? There's never really any sense of that, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, I think what's kind of interesting about that is how you've played the DLC episodes as well, right?
Yeah.
So again, for some further context, there were some DLC episodes released where you got to play as different characters, and that feels very like, again, Twin Peaks to me, where like Twin Peaks it comes from this beautiful age of television where you can have an hour-long TV hour episode and get to see different characters' perspectives, and that's so difficult to do with games. Again, because of like budget and scope, like you can't really play as more than one character a lot of the time, even though this is a AA game, because that requires animating them, and that also it's not just animating them. Like, well, are they clipping into anything? Are they affecting anything else in the scene? Like, you can't just put another character model there and call it a day. It's just not how it works. Again, particularly because of the level of fidelity things have now, and I think that's probably kind of where Alan Wake 1 and 2 fall flat even though Alan Wake 2 does have two characters you can play as, you're not getting the heart of what is that, like Twin Peaks, which is the townspeople. And so through the townspeople in Twin Peaks, you can learn again about some of the politics, about some of the ways that other people's decisions are affecting their lives. Whereas in Alan Wake 2, it is more about that kind of like dichotomy between what Alan Wake has done as a writer and the effects of his you know, the what is it, the Altered World event or experience or something like that, and how that's affecting Saga, but less so the people of Bright Falls. I think probably through bits of flavor text, like documents you find throughout the game, but like there's always such the most boring ways to experience bits of lore, because it's just like, well, I'm just reading a thing now, like, and that's not.
And there's too much reading.
And there's too much reading, which is fine if like that's kind of the point. You're playing a visual novel or something, but it breaks up the flow, and I'm not getting to know the characters always, particularly when like it's such a like supplement to what else it could be. And again, then you worry about scope creep, like maybe the game gets too big. It is just like a AA game. It's not like massive budget, so I understand limitations, but that doesn't also mean it's not a shame.
Yeah, I wonder on this topic, there aren't like tons of other games that come to mind for me on this specific topic of kind of like suburbia and the politics of that, but potentially the most recent project of the team behind the original Life is Strange, Lost Records Bloom and Rage.
Yeah.
Would be an interesting one to talk about here. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the politics of Velvet Cove, Charlotte.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we don't see a lot of like what the adults are getting up to in Velvet Cove, right? Like I think that's one of the really interesting things about Lost Records, is that you actually don't, even you hear Swan's mum, but you never see her, and you know, you kind of hear little snippets about the other's parents, but you actually never see any of the parents. The closest to adults that we actually see are Corey and Dylan, who are like, I think they're like, you know, really like young adults. They're like 20, 21-ish, maybe 23, I think Corey is. But yeah, they're kind of the oldest adults that we get in there, like, apart from maybe like Pam, but they're not, Pam and Gus aren't really like strong presences in the, especially not in their like earlier days for the girls. And I think there's something there about kind of that freedom of childhood and things like that, but there's definitely a lot going on in terms of like, you know, the kind of, I guess the smaller social politics between the girls. Like we obviously get quite a lot about like Nora being from quite a wealthy family, and like Autumn having to work during her summer, like she has to work at the ice cream stall, and you know, you do get kind of a sense of sort of class and community, and like who are pillars of the community versus who aren't in Velvet Cove, even just through the snippets we see of the girls. Like we kind of obviously have this stuff about Kat's family, the Michelsons owning this ranch, and that being quite a big, I guess, source of income. But that's their source of income, but it's also probably quite a big source of income for tourism for the town, and you know, that being kind of around hunting, and you know, it's quite a kind of white American pastime in terms of the way that Velvet Cove presents it. But of course, hunting was originally done by Native Americans in the land, and they knew how to do it more sustainably and things like that. And yeah. I think there's a lot, I guess, of commentary about whose right it is to like cage and kill animals, and there's a lot to do with also disability politics, of course, within Bloom and Rage, and how Kat kind of is positioned as a disabled girl, and the way that her parents basically don't let her do anything. They don't let her leave the house. They don't want her to, you know, see the world or do anything, in this kind of weird bid for control and protection. But the protection isn't really protection, because ultimately what's killing her is internal, not external, you know?
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting point. I feel like as you were speaking, I was thinking that in a lot of ways, the kind of scope and focus of Lost Records Bloom and Rage feels in some ways kind of like less like it has this enormous scale and enormous stakes that Life is Strange has. So it potentially offers less of this kind of like more political narrative than Life is Strange has in the way that Life is Strange does.
Yeah.
But it definitely does explore those things like in different ways. And I guess it's like, even though it doesn't feel like, I don't know, like capitalism is the big bad like the way it is in Life is Strange, it is still like very political games with a lot of themes about like, okay, when you are someone who is powerless, like a teenage girl, like a disabled girl, like all of that, you're powerless, which obviously is a political thing.
Yeah.
Like, how do you engage with that? Like, do you fight back? Do you follow the rules? Like, so it's like I feel like in a lot of ways it's a game about like how you engage with power when you're someone who is like marginalized or feels powerless.
Definitely.
But this also kind of makes me think that a lot of like Life is Strange, Velvet Cove, Life is Strange, and Arcadia Bay, and Haven Springs, I think as well, and also Bloom and Rage with Velvet Cove. A lot of these characters leave the town. So I think that's pretty significant in terms of like, you know, how a lot of these games inspired by Twin Peaks, they focus on like a town and they kind of like explore the politics of this town, like in some, you know, perhaps similarly or different to the way that Twin Peaks does. Life is Strange True Colors literally makes you choose whether or not to leave Haven Springs. In Life is Strange, you can save Arcadia Bay and by implication stay there, or you can be like, fuck the town, save my lesbian girlfriend and leave.
Which valid.
Or with Bloom and Rage, I think all of them leave, right?
They all
like
leave,
Nora.
all leave Velvet Cove. And I think there's also something to that in terms of like a coming of age narrative. And I mean, I think we can maybe talk a bit about the return in this context as well, but we can kind of get to that. But there's definitely something about like a coming of age narrative and like leaving the small town for something bigger. And I think there's definitely something along those lines happening, especially in like Bloom and Rage, where, you know, none of the girls have actually been back to the town in 27 years. And that really, you know, you can really see that kind of weird familiarity of like, oh, we've been here before, but everything feels so different and everything has changed in terms of our relationship to each other and our lives, and, you know, we've grown up away from this place. And and I obviously with I always think with True Colors, I know we've talked a bit about like, I guess, our stances on leaving the small town in True Colors and like the end point. And I think it is very interesting that the idea of staying in Haven Springs is very linked to Ryan, and the idea of leaving Haven Springs is very linked to Steph. And obviously you can choose to stay with Steph, like be with Steph and stay in Haven Springs, and vice versa, which I do feel like is potentially cowardice on the creators' part, just because they didn't want everyone to kick off about, you know, the choices people are making. But I do think that like thematically maybe what should have happened is you can only be with Steph if you leave, and you can only be with Ryan if you stay, you know. And maybe, you know, but I guess that's kind of my interpretation of how that choice feels politically, or like kind of more structurally.
Well, a lot of these characters are queer women as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
contemplating that.
We've talked a lot about, like, I mean, you know, there are no canon queer characters in at least the original Twin Peaks. I can't think of any in the return. Obviously, we can argue Laura Palmer, queer character, but for the most part, we don't get canon queerness happening in that show. But yeah, I think there is definitely something to be said about queer people and queer characters not necessarily wanting to stay in a small town where they're like a tiny minority and they don't have any other queer community around them. I think that's something to be said, and that's why I'm quite passionate about Alex leaving Haven Springs at the end of True Colours is purely just so she can like find some solid queer community and like, you know, also not just be surrounded by a town that like tried to cover up the death of her dad and brother. You know, I think there's kind of a lot there for me about that, but I think there's something to be said about like she does kind of create some kind of community throughout the game, but I personally don't know if it's as strong as it needs to be for her to want to stay there. But that's my kind of always been my interpretation, I guess.
I guess the question this leaves us with is, would Laura Palmer have been saved if she left Twin Peaks with her girlfriend?
Well, I mean, if her and Donna had held hands and skipped off into the sun together, I don't know. I think
it's, you know, it's funny though, because like, you know, of course a lot of people read, us included, read like Laura and Donna as like queer characters, and apparently Mark Frost wrote in that book that he wrote about what happens between The Return and season 2 that Donna goes to New York.
Well, yeah, because Donna's not in The Return.
No, she's not.
And yeah, I think it does always feel like Donna is someone who isn't gonna stay in Twin Peaks forever, you know. I think you kind of have those characters that you do feel like they're always gonna stay, and I think they do. Like, you know, you kind of have these Shelleys and your Bobbies who are, you know, pretty resolutely gonna grow up but stay in Twin Peaks for sure. And then I think Donna, partly because she comes from like a very middle class family, and like her dad's a doctor, and like, you know, her and her sisters, their creative pursuits are kind of encouraged, and you know, they're very much shown as this very like nuclear loving family, but also have the wealth, I guess, the finances for her to move away, in a way that Shelley, for instance, definitely doesn't. We don't even see her parents. We don't even know what her family looks like. We just know she married Leo and dropped out of school and works at a diner. So, you know, they're obviously coming from very different class positions anyway. But I think Donna was always kind of written as a character who would want to leave, I think. And I think especially when, you know, obviously there's a lot of Donna and James, and I don't give a fuck about James, but
That's so real.
I think it says a lot that Donna spends so much of her time with James, who is a guy who skips town all the fucking time, you know? James just hits the bricks like constantly. He's just like off on his fucking motorcycle. And I think there's something in that, you know?
I guess like in terms of like the question and leaving and stuff, it's like the ills that plague these towns, you can't run away from them, right? They're everywhere.
Yeah.
But I guess like, I don't know, for example, like I think about like, for example, you know, Steph in True Colors, or Autumn in Lost Records, Bloom and Rage. And I think, you know, Autumn going to Atlanta doesn't mean that she escapes racism or capitalism, but there are more black people there.
Yeah. Yeah. And similar for Stefan, like finding queer community, you know, when we play Wavelengths, which is the DLC for True Colors and kind of a prequel, there's like a kind of a mechanic where you look on a dating app and you see Steph's options in terms of like people she can date. And a lot of them are like, bear in mind, Haven Springs is like a very small mining town that is literally cut off from like the rest of the world. And most of the people that Steph actually like could hook up with via dating app are all in like Denver and like actual towns, and like places that are more connected, you know. Like, it is very clear when you play Wavelengths that Steph doesn't need that community necessarily just for romantic options. I think it's also just that like culture that she really misses, and there is a charm to Haven Springs, but it doesn't necessarily initially feel like a charm that she would want to stay in forever, which I think is very interesting. And it's interesting that Gabe kind of talks her into staying for a year, but like, you can tell during that Wavelengths time that that's not always been, you know, that year's not necessarily a happy year, I guess. And she has some community there, and there, you know, there are connections to be had, and obviously she has Gabe until he dies, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's a year where she's really living. It's almost like she's taking a break from living in a way. Like, it feels like a diversion rather than her journey. And yeah, I don't know what to kind of infer from that, from like a kind of political perspective, but I think in terms of a queer woman, you know, living in a choosing where to live, like what space to live in, where to be in her life, especially one who has literally been displaced due to Arcadia Bay obviously no longer existing, or her deciding to leave Arcadia Bay after her friends have died in quite horrible ways. You know, she is trying to find a place that she feels like she belongs to, and I don't ever really get the sense that she does feel like she belongs to Haven Springs, but maybe she finds home in Alex if she does stay in Haven Springs, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess what comes to mind for me is that, like, as we know, David Lynch was a straight white man. Even though he did make one of the best lesbian movies of all time. I
believe it or not.
They all get one. They all get one really good lesbian movie.
Not all of them.
Well, it's all in there somewhere. Just whether or not they manage to pull it out of their souls.
If they can have the ability, like David Lynch, to really reflect and introspect, but also cast Naomi Watts, then yes, they can in fact make it happen.
Yeah, but I guess like a lot of what we're seeing in these games that are inspired by David Lynch is that some of them are potentially like concerned with I guess exploring marginalized perspectives within these contexts a bit more than David Lynch was, because again, it's like, you know how much I love Twin Peaks, and I think that like part of the conversation today will definitely be about like how patriarchy is a huge theme in his work, and that's kind of like how he explores like ideas of good and evil a lot of the time. But like his movies are so fucking white, you know, and he didn't exactly have like man wasn't a socialist, like he didn't exactly have like those kind of politics. I think that like how he engages with class, or, you know, potentially doesn't engage with class, is those are all like valid critiques to have of David Lynch. So I guess that one of the nice things about exploring like, you know, artists who are inspired by his works is like when they do explore marginalized perspectives in that. Yeah.
I mean, something I was also, and I think it could again be something we kind of bring up later, is and I guess still in conversation with Twin Peaks specifically and Life is Strange, is disability, and how I think Twin Peaks has a really weird relationship to disability, and I wouldn't say it's a good one. I think there's a few kind of obvious examples. Gordon Cole, who is a deaf man, who does sort of, I think, wear a hearing aid, but basically the whole joke is that he can't hear anyone, so he's shouting at them all the time. And that's like pretty much entirely played for laughs, definitely in the kind of original kind of run of Twin Peaks. Like, I think there's maybe a little bit more nuance in the return, but not much. So that's comedic, right? That's
the Leo
plotline.
plotline.
Well, yeah, that was my next one. So Leo, who is a fucking scumbag and is Shelley's abusive husband, gets shot, and basically, I think, well, I don't know the best term to use to explain what happens, but he loses a lot of the function of his brain, basically, and needs constant care in order to do anything. He is unable to move, speak, do a lot of things for himself. So there is quite an interesting, I guess, setup for Shelley as a character, who I actually do think of Shelley as probably one of the more marginalised characters in Twin Peaks, and I don't think the show really necessarily thinks about that in an actual critical way, but like it's definitely something I feel when watching it, is that she is probably one of the most kind of oppressed by the society in Twin Peaks, in that she has no money of her own. She is completely seems to have been brought up to be completely dependent on men. She doesn't have any kind of qualifications or anything. She works in a diner, which she loves, and I love that for her, and I'm so glad that she has that space that she feels like is hers. But in terms of class position, she is probably, one of the least affluent characters that we see on Twin Peaks, for sure. And she, again, is in this very abusive relationship and then finds herself having to care for her abusive husband because Bobby sort of talks her into it in a way to get more money, and then they don't actually get any money, and she has to live on like $42 a month or something crazy. And this is a very interesting one because I think, you get this woman who has been abused by this man, who she now has to care for him. But equally, this is a disabled man who can't, take care of himself. And she is in a position of power over him now. And, I mean, they make fun of Leo. They don't just make fun of him, they actively abuse him. And again, it's complicated because, yes, in a just world, Shelley would not be having to look after, be the one to care for her abusive husband. Of course, 100%. But ultimately, this is the position that she's now in, and it does feel deeply uncomfortable to watch, especially with, Bobby, shoving his face in some cake, or, there's all these kind of really uncomfortable scenes where they're both just making fun of him and fun of the situation, and it does just feel very gross. And again, I don't really ever and Leo does kind of magically kind of gain the ability to move and speak again, but I think his cognitive abilities are, clearly still not what they once were. And that's still kind of played for kind of, I guess, goofiness.
Well, he's then exploited by Wyndham Earle.
Exactly.
It's the thing of not only is disability at the butt of the joke, but with Leo, it's also disability as punishment, for what he's done.
Absolutely, and I think his predicament in that. That kind of part of the series does actually remind me a lot of Chloe Price and the timeline in which she is also, in a wheelchair and physically impaired and unable to, do a lot of things herself, or at least doesn't have the assistive ability to look after herself. And there does feel like this kind of strange relationship that her parents, who we kind of obviously met, and we know them in another timeline, right? And we know that her parents they are both people who love Chloe. Whether they love her correctly or not is a different matter. But what we have seen of both of her parents are that they do love her, and they are still not being good parents to a disabled child, and they are still exerting power over her and neglecting and abusing her, whether deliberately or not. It is still very much what's happening, and it does feel like a kind of commentary on that kind of powerlessness. And I mean, I guess then Chloe does ask you to help her die, and obviously here at Game Assist, our stance is very much you should not help Chloe to kill herself, because disabled people's lives are worth living, and that it's not about people being disabled. It's about the fact that we could actually give people better accommodations in order to have free will and be able to enact their own free will, rather than be again in this situation of neglect and abuse. I don't know, that choice really does kind of, I guess, hammer home for me, Leo doesn't even get any kind of choice in that situation. And again, we're kind of being put across as this being of punishment, but for Chloe it's almost like this is Max's punishment, right? This is Max's punishment for mucking around with timelines, that she has to see Chloe like this and she has to be asked to make this decision. And it's very much...
I mean, it's... It's kind of framed that way at the end of episode 3, right? It's a shock. It's framed as this shocking reveal at the end of episode 3 when Chloe is disabled. But actually, on the disability and Lynch topic, which I think is a great one, thanks, Charlotte. Fia, I think I saw you log the Elephant Man into Letterboxd recently. And that is, I don't think you haven't seen The Elephant Man, have you, Charlotte?
No, I haven't, no.
This is, in a lot of ways, the Lynch film where disability is probably the most, like, obvious theme. It's about, I believe his name was Joseph Merrick, who was a man with facial differences, who lived in London in the 1800s. So it's based on a true story, and Lynch was hired to make a biopic about this man, and that film has some very complex politics in relation to disability, but super interested in, because it must be fresh in your mind, Fia, I'm pretty interested in your thoughts on that, and I guess like some of the games that might come to mind for you.
Yeah, I literally watched that like a week ago, I think, because I wanted to get that one and Inland Empire before we recorded this, so I made sure to watch them. It was a very complicated film. I think at its heart it was like trying very desperately to be, and sincerely so, I don't think it was like condescendingly so, empathetic towards, because is it in the film that he's called John Merrick? I think that's the way they just changed it for some reason. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, they changed his name in the film, I think.
The real person's name was Joseph Merrick, and then they changed it to John Merrick. Or whichever other way around. It felt like it was trying, for the time that it released in, which was mid-80s or so, something like that. Which I also was like surprised by when I learned when the film actually came out, because it's a film that looks like it should be from the 50s with the black and white quality, which I think is an interesting way to present it. It felt like it was trying to humanize such a person in a way that a lot of other media didn't at the time. Like, I haven't seen The Goonies, but there's a character whose name I do not know, but he is a character with facial differences, and I think cognitive differences as well, and again I think is like similarly to like Leo, what you were saying, Charlotte, like a bit played for laughs. There's a famous line where he goes, "Hey you guys," and again I think a kind of approach to it. And so for them to come out in a similar kind of era, the era of the 80s, which is a bit too all-encompassing really, but that's what it was, is so surprising to have as a deuteragonist, I guess, because there's also the Doctor, who I guess is also the other protagonist. And I kind of talked about this in my Letterboxd review, I don't remember, but I was curious if was the Doctor named Strakes, I think, something like that, played by Anthony Hopkins, very, very well, of course, because it's Anthony Hopkins. The whole thing is that in the film, the titular Elephant Man, the reason he's called that is because he is at as part of what was referred to as freak shows at the time, where you would have little people, you would have bearded ladies, all these kinds of things, and just someone who I think was just very tall as well. It's obviously it is a way for his owner at the time to just profit and exploit him because of the way that he looks. And then this is kind of a thing that is reflected upon in the film as well, with the Doctor and how Merrick is introduced to high society and all these people that want to meet him because, like, oh, have you heard of this elephant man that's staying at this hospital? And so they want to go meet him to have a thing to have done to tell their other rich friends. At least that's what it feels like implicitly anyway. And then the Doctor is like reflecting upon this, and I was kind of wondering if that was an admission of Lynch doing the same, because it's no matter what you are doing, particularly through the act of applying makeup and prosthetics to another actor, you are making a show of this character. It cannot be helped by the act of making the film. And having this Doctor who because it was based on diary entries and findings and things like that of writings about Merrick at the time. It feels like an insight from the Doctor that I don't know if he would have like volunteered, and I wonder if it is kind of a self-insert moment of Lynch's to display, like, am I doing this myself through making this film? because I feel like Lynch was very... I think he put himself in his work very much so. Like, you can see that in Dale Cooper. That just kind of is him, aside from him being in it as Gordon Cole. Yeah.
Also, what's his name? The guy from Blue Velvet that Kyle MacLachlan plays. And it's funny because a lot of people who know them have said that, you know, David and Kyle were very similar. So I wonder how often he gets Kyle to play characters that kind of represent himself in a way. But that character, a friend pointed out to me that that character in Blue Velvet dresses exactly like David Lynch did at the time. Lost Highway, the house is based on David Lynch's house. It has some of his wife's paintings in it. Yeah.
Interesting.
So honestly, it's such a great point because, like, when we kind of talk about political critiques of Lynch, there's also ways that you can't help but wonder sometimes whether he's kind of critiquing himself in some of his work.
I feel like he was a very self-reflective person. This is like an assumption, like I can't, you know, say if this is true or not. But I think he loved for himself and others to put themselves in their work. Because again, Kyle MacLachlan's character in Blue Velvet, I think I read somewhere that, or I think he said this in an interview or something, that the outfits that he wore in Blue Velvet were just his own outfits, actually, at the time. He was just borrowing from his own wardrobe to try and help embody that character. And I feel like it's a theme kind of throughout Lynch's work of putting themselves into their work, because there are a number of actors throughout that I can only assume are non-actors, which, to provide context on that, they were not professionally trained. In fact, they normally didn't really appear in anything else. They, depending on the film, might be just pulled from the street. Like, it's about trying to get as natural a performance as possible in some occasions, and in others, in Lynch's case, it often resulted in a very stilted, awkward atmosphere, an uncomfortable atmosphere, but there's an honesty to it as well, which I think, again, we haven't really spoken about much in terms of the influence that Lynch had on his Silent Hill 2 was very purposeful in the performances there. They're very awkward and uncomfortable.
I can't wait to talk about Silent Hill 2, by the way.
Oh, I think I have things to say about that in relation to kind of like the presentation of disability.
Yeah, go on.
Oh,
yes. Oh, my God, yes.
Yeah, of course, because with Silent Hill 2, you have various different monsters and creatures that are disfigured in various ways. They are brutalized in some ways. They have different bodily differences, and it's like they are very purposely psychological representations of things that James thinks and feels that are up to the audience to interpret, unless you are Masahiro Ito, who says, no, that is incorrect, which he does way too fucking often, the character designer.
He's like, subtext? I don't know what the hell that is.
Yeah.
Which also is like the opposite of Lynch's philosophy of art, which, just to point out, is incredibly funny. Like, the guy who famously, like, when you asked him what his work meant, would like be like, I'm not saying a word.
Yeah, like, Eraserhead is my most spiritual work, believe it or not. Talk more on that. No. Fucking great.
Whereas Masahiro Ito is like, oh, so this is how I interpret it. So you're like, this is how I interpret your work. He's like, you're wrong. This is what I meant.
Yeah. And it's really frustrating that he does that. I guess this is kind of like almost an inside baseball thing. For, again, extra context, Masahiro Ito is the creature and monster designer from Silent Hill 2. He best known for Pyramid Head, the classic villain from Silent Hill 2. And he just doesn't know what Shut the Fuck Up Friday is, because he will be on Twitter all the time.
Is he like the Stephen King of like video games, where he's just like always yapping about some bullshit, and you're just like, yeah, no one asked, actually.
Yeah, but it's like, I think it's an issue where like a lot of fans of Japanese games have such a desperation to connect with the creators of them, because there's like a real fascination over them. And so, because these people are on Twitter and now we can talk to them, it's like, wow, I'm going to. And Masahiro Ito can seemingly speak an amount of English. And there are just so many occasions where people will say their opinions and he'll be like, no, that is not true. That is not what we intended. And it's like, I don't fucking care, buddy.
Yeah. It's so fascinating how many, and it's usually men, just really want you to just interpret something very specific from their work, and any other kind of interpretation is just wrong. You know? Yeah. And yeah, I think it's also like Sorry, I was just going to say the beauty of a lot of Lynch's work is that he is the whole point is that he wants you to make your own decision about what it means, and like he wants you to discuss it with people, and he wants you to think about it and use your brain. That's the beauty in it, you know. That is kind of one of the most wonderful things I've found. Like now, you know, roughly 10 years after I first tried to watch Twin Peaks, I can understand now that it's weird and it's confusing, but that's because he wanted me to think about it rather than just go, okay, cool, right, procedural, I'm just gonna get on with my life after this, you know.
Just briefly, I guess that I feel like me and Caitlin,
my Caitlin?
Your Caitlin, Fia's
my
Caitlin.
My partner Caitlin.
Have been talking a lot recently about how Silent Hill fandom is like has a very particular way of engaging with the games, which is like which I think is like facilitated by attitudes like the one that Masahiro Ito has, which is that they're like, this is what the game means and I am correct. And I think that, you know, Lynch was so resistant to that, and yet there are fans of David Lynch who do possess such an attitude.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when you kind of like go on YouTube and there are all of these videos that are like Mulholland Drive explained, and you're like, if David Lynch could find your IP address, if he could come back from the grave and find your IP address and kill you,
he would do it. But in a heartbeat.
I literally heard like a quote from him where he was like against even just doing DVD commentaries, which were obviously quite a popular thing when DVDs were growing in popularity themselves. Like he was just so against not even over explaining himself, just explaining
himself.
Yeah, which I think is just beautiful. And like I think even just like behind the scenes things of how the Eraserhead baby was made, which I guess is maybe also a topic for disability on this one. But yeah, he was just so against it. But to go back to Silent Hill 2 and this kind of presentation of disability and things like that, it's a complicated one because I think it is so important to Silent Hill 2 because they are purposely designed, the monsters and these creatures, they're purposely designed to make you feel uncomfortable, particularly because of how they lean into the uncanny valley and how they quote-unquote distort the body and how they treat the body as an object. And I guess it's kind of like, it depends on how you feel about it. Like, is this an okay thing to do at all? Or is the fact that the context here is that this is a representation of how protagonist James is viewing the world, does that change things? I think it does, to a certain degree, but then there's like the self-reflective thing of, okay, but why are we creating something where we have to be disgusted by the body in some shape or form? Maybe that's a point for discussion.
It's an interesting one because I was thinking about that in relation to like the video game as form with like Silent Hill 2, which is to say that like there is always some kind of like relationship, like affective relationship, as in like an emotional relationship that you have with the avatar that you play as in a game. So I think that games where the avatar that you play as is a character that is potentially like not one that's like very sympathetic or is kind of like one who does horrible things always fascinates me in general, and I think particularly in Silent Hill 2, because I think this is part of the reason why people, without even knowing it, are so quick to defend James. Because when you play a video game, especially a horror game, right? In a horror game, you're scared and you're fighting for your life. And that's kind of the experience that you have of playing a horror game. So in a lot of ways, I think that you want to feel that what you are doing when you run around Silent Hill and you kill all of these monsters is right, and that it doesn't make you a bad person to do it. So it's funny. I think that the interactivity of the video game kind of enables a really particular potential for self-reflection, because I feel like I was playing it and I kind of was like, I was terrified and I was like killing the monsters, and then you know how like when you kill the monster you can kind of give it this particularly violent kick. initially I was like kind of like, oh, about that, but then sometimes when I was like really, really scared and I was like fighting off the monsters, sometimes I would like kick them several times to make sure they were dead, and I was like, oh, that's horrible. And then obviously like the more that I played the game and the more I kind of like realized about James and what he had done, the more I was like, fuck. Because I've convinced myself that what I'm doing is okay because I'm defending my life, but how do I read that in relation to what James did to his own wife? Like, that he justified it to himself because he wanted to live his own life and she was in the way.
Such an interesting playing of that like horror game convention as well, isn't it? It's so interesting, and I love when, even with like, I mean, I think it was discussed a bit in your essay about like war or like kind of the military in video games, and it's that sudden realization of like, okay, who is it I'm actually killing and why? Because so many games just function off this, like survival, like I have to kill all these people because they're gonna kill me. And then when you actually like think about it for like 5 seconds, you're like, oh fuck, like I'm just mowing down these, like, you know, in the case of Silent Hill 2, like oppressed women for the most part, like, you know, all of them are feminine coded, right?
Yeah, and with Silent Hill and 2 in particular, it's the lost highway of it all for me. Like, I think that there's a particular scene that makes me think of Blue Velvet, and it's the scene where James is looking through kind of the shutters of a closet onto Pyramid Head, you know, sexually assaulting and murdering some of the like feminine monsters.
Which I would also like to say again is a thing that Ito kind of like disputes, and I'm like, man, shut the fuck up, you're making your game worse.
No, truly, especially because like every time I think about that, I'm like, you can't tell me that I'm not looking at rape. Like, you can't gaslight me into thinking that's not what I'm looking at.
It's also such a like man thing to do, and it's like, sorry, do you actually know what that looks like? Because we can all see it, so maybe you're wrong.
Which actually, I have a point to make about that in a moment, about the like depoliticization that I think is happening there. But sorry, you finish.
Oh, sure, yeah. Can I just finish my thought about that scene? Yeah. Because that is it reminds me like exactly of that scene in Blue Velvet where Jeffrey, I think his name is Jeffrey Beaumont, that's I think what his name is in the closet, I know, and he's looking through the shutters of the closet onto I want to say Frank sexually assaulting Dorothy, looking upon this scene of sexual violence, but in particular, like, you know, when you think about those scenes in relation to the text as a whole, like, for Jeffrey, like, part of the whole thing is that Jeffrey insists that he's nothing like Frank. And when he sees what Frank does to Dorothy, he's like, I would never do that. But then, of course, when he sleeps with Dorothy for the first time and she asks him to hit her, he does it, and he's horrified with himself. And it's like, that's part of the tension of Blue Velvet, is that Jeffrey tries to convince himself that he's not like Frank, but in many ways he is. And that scene really hits me that way in Silent Hill 2 as well, right? Because James is like watching Pyramid Head do this thing, but as the game unfolds, not only is Pyramid Head like part of James or a version of James or a reflection of James, but what he is doing is you know, something that in some shape or form James has himself done, but has repressed that. And it's the way that, and I guess again that kind of leads us to the lost highway of it all, because of these you know, Blue Velvet and Lost Highway in different ways are both films about men who want to convince themselves that they are good people, that they would never hurt a woman. But they do, and they like psychologically cannot cope with that, because it just completely like erodes their sense of self, because they have to believe that they're a good person. And I think that this is I feel like there's a lot more to say about Lost Highway and Silent Hill 2, but to just wrap that thought before giving back to you, Fia, on the depoliticization thing that you want to talk about, this is deeply ironic because of the way that many people engage with Silent Hill 2, which I just alluded to, and is the idea that they are so, like, deeply invested in defending James. I think because it makes them uncomfortable to think about, like, what they, as the player, are engaging in. They want to be playing the hero. When people play video games, they want to be playing the hero, right?
Yeah.
And when you're playing as James, you're not playing a hero.
No. There's too much of a sense of, like, wish fulfillment that appears in games still to this day, like, particularly with even, you know, particularly with, like, gacha games where there are women that have jiggle physics that are unfathomably wobbly, and it's all about, like...
I don't know what you mean, Fear. I move like that.
I used to once upon a time, before the big chop.
All I can say is...
The big chop of my titties.
But yeah, it's this thing of, like, always pleasing the player, always making the player feel like they are not doing anything bad themselves, and which I think is an interesting thing with Silent Hill 2 in particular, with that scene of like the voyeuristic sensibilities it has, and how you are robbed from having any control over the scene, because, like, you are switching from controlling James as a character to then moving to a cutscene, and it's kind of forcing you to experience that particular moment. And with that particular moment and the depoliticization point I make, I will segue just ever so slightly for a moment, but still on topic, moving to Link's Awakening, I think a tonal opposite of Silent Hill 2, just completely. The reason I bring it up is because Link's Awakening is actually quite famously also really deeply inspired by Twin Peaks, which is surprising for a Zelda game. There was even an interview, I think maybe last year, within the last couple of years, because Mark Frost tweeted about Link's Awakening one time, being like, after years of speculation, because no one knew, like, what the connection really was between Twin Peaks and Link's Awakening, they just knew it was an influence. And then Mark Frost was just like, yeah, the guys that made this reached out to me one time to chat about Twin Peaks, and is this game any good?
Damn, that's
and
crazy.
So again, this is when Link's Awakening was first being developed, and then in an interview with The Verge, Frost kind of explained, like, what happened, and he said it was literally just one conversation, and it was about them trying to understand like Twin Peaks and its cast of characters, because the thing with Link's Awakening is that it is this kind of, like, dreamlike world, very, very different from the other Zeldas, where Link is meeting a strange cast of characters. Like, there's even a character that just looks like Kirby, which is very unusual for a Zelda game. And I think a big problem with it in that sense, in its borrowings from Twin Peaks, is that it loses all of that political edge. All art is obviously political to some degree, you can find something in it, but it's not the politics that Lynch has in his work or Twin Peaks. And I think that is the thing that happens with Silent Hill 2, particularly with, like, Ito talking about the game too much, and the way that fans talk about the game, is a depoliticization of it, is a removal of its themes, and just kind of saying, oh, it's really deep, but not getting into the whys of why it is deep or interesting, or just a complete misread of it. I think that happens a lot with Bioshock Infinite as well. Not at all to do with Lynch, but just, yeah. It's like, it's deep and interesting because there's a plot twist, and it's, like, dramatic and emotional, but it's completely ignoring the horrendous politics it has. And similarly, that happens with Silent Hill 2. People ignore the interesting politics it has, the discussions of the treatment of women that James exhibits through, like, the nurses and Mary and Maria themselves. And it's very, very frustrating, because it's like, why do you like this game in the first place if the thing that you just find it interesting is that James is deep and complex but provide no reasoning as to why?
But it's also like, I mean, James doesn't have any introspection, so, like, where are you getting this from? You know, like, as in, like, where are these people getting, oh, well, James is such a complicated character? It's like, okay, he's a complicated character because he killed his wife, but for complicated reasons. Like, but again, you don't get his own introspection. You don't get actually his own dealing with that, which would have made him an interesting, I mean, he's an interesting character, but, you know, would have made him maybe an interesting character for different reasons, rather than...
Yeah, it's... Yeah. Well, I guess James has that in common with Israel, but...
How to fit that in somewhere.
No, interesting. I'm into that. James Sunderland is actually Israel. Who knew?
You know, sees himself as the victim, has no introspection, like, you know, it was justified when I killed all of those people who were powerless over me.
Wife killing's bad, but it's okay when he does it.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's because Mary was anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
I will tell you 3 things. If I tell you these things, and you find satisfaction, then will you believe me? Think of me as a steward. The first thing I will tell you is that there is a beast named Algorithm. In exchange for its bounty, it requires a sacrifice. A thumb that points towards the clouds. Words that bloom from a board. And a promise to return. The second thing is, there is a humble band of sages that seek to understand the beast. In their noble, knowledge-seeking endeavours, the sages require resources. Retrieve your paper, but the one found in the computer, and deliver it to the orange pea or the blue coffee. The third thing is, the sages seek to grow their dominion and seek followers, whether in the house of the blue bird, the pale sky, or the palace of pictures. Go on this journey with them. This is all I'm permitted to say. Give me your patronage. In return, I will give you moving images filled with voices and texts that harbour truths. We want to help you.
Before the commercial break, we were... commercial break, sorry, that makes it sound so corporate. Before the Patreon break, we are a community-led, funded cooperative.
Before the co-op break,
We're sponsored by Big Pharma and you know it. We're trying to inject woke into everything. Big Pharma's paying us big bucks.
If only. No, I'm kidding.
If only. We were talking a little bit about Silent Hill 2 and Link's awakening in relation to kind of like disability and also kind of, I guess, like a relationships that people have with the texts and how they interpret them. Kind of, those were some of the things we were talking about before the break. So I think we were kind of going to jump back into Silent Hill 2 a little bit in relation to David Lynch's Lost Highway.
Yes.
And yeah, we mentioned earlier that for a lot of the potential kind of like flaws or drawbacks of the politics of Lynch's works, one of the kind of major kind of themes across a lot of his work is that themes about kind of like good and evil are often explored through violence against women, and through kind of like patriarchal kind of dynamics or narratives and how those are explored within his works, which is sometimes from the man's perspective and is often kind of like a kind of interior critique in a lot of ways of kind of like patriarchal masculinity, which kind of brings us back to like, you know, David Lynch's relationship with himself in his work, but also sometimes that is from the perspective of women, like in Fire Walk With Me or Mulholland Drive, so kind of like you know, victims of that kind of violence. Silent Hill 2 is very much in the former category, because as we've kind of already talked about a little bit, you play as James, who murdered his disabled wife. And
sure
I think that he sure fucking did that. It's the thing is, you could never say that enough times for people to like understand the magnitude of it, apparently. That is what I learned when I was streaming Silent Hill 2. But anyway, I think that Lost Highway is kind of the text that I think of the most. I mentioned Blue Velvet a bit, but I think because for people who haven't seen Lost Highway, broadly it is about it kind of starts with a man named Fred, who is a experimental jazz musician, and is married to a woman named Renee, played by Patricia Arquette. They start receiving these mysterious videotapes, and which is also significant in relation to Silent Hill 2. And they get, things that kind of get to this point where he receives a video, like his wife is missing, he receives a videotape, and basically like it's implied in the videotape that he killed his wife. the way that that's presented in the game sort of similarly, in the movie, lol, sort of similarly to Silent Hill 2, wherein you also find out that James killed his wife through a tape, so very similar in that way, is that the footage is like, you don't see kind of like this very explicit graphic or violent representation of the murder. Instead, it's kind of like framed, like, you know, for example, in Lost Highway, it's like you see the moment after Fred has killed Renee, and it's like, you know, graphic and he's covered in blood, but it's like a snapshot, it's like a second that you see it.
You barely register it, really. You
barely register it, yeah. Similarly, in Silent Hill 2, when you see the tape with James, you know, killing Mary, it's kind of like this distortion, like you see him kind of like leaning over her in this ominous way, and then it kind of like, you know, cuts and distorts, but you hear these awful sounds of her kind of asphyxiating to death, and which kind of like is so interesting, right? Because it's like within those tapes, which are kind of the evidence, the recording of the fact that they murdered their wives, it's still somehow like beyond representation, because these men are so unable to kind of like confront themselves in their own actions. But Fred is imprisoned for the murder of his wife, and essentially has an experience that you could describe in all sorts of in different ways. But what happens is that there's kind of this mysterious event, like a flash of light, and then suddenly in the cell where Fred was, there is this young man named Pete. So, you know, this kind of leads us to interpret, especially at the end of the film, that Fred and Pete are versions of the same person, which is something that Lynch loves to do in his work. Now living this kind of new free life as Pete, as a much younger man, he meets a woman called Alice, who looks exactly like Renee, which again is something that Lynch loves to do in his work. And Pete kind of goes through this whole narrative where he saves Alice from this kind of like mysterious force where she's being, you know, kind of like sexually exploited by this mafia and blah blah blah. So he gets to be kind of the savior in this narrative, but then in the last portion of the film, reality kind of really breaks apart. We realize that Fred and Pete are the same person, and that, you know, he kind of in a lot of ways, you can interpret it anyway as him constructing this narrative about himself and his relationship to his wife, because he's so in denial about the fact that he murdered her. And that feels very similar to what's going on with James in Silent Hill 2. He, you know, shows up in Silent Hill having received a letter from his wife, Mary, who died of an illness. He kind of is like, could Mary be alive? Is she in Silent Hill? Then along the way, he meets someone called Maria, which is a version of the name Mary, and she looks exactly like Mary, but like in cuntier clothes and with a cunty little blonde bob with pink dip dye. And
a cunty Christina Aguilera, was it, outfit from the...
Absolutely, yeah. Her outfit, I think, is inspired by Christina Aguilera's Teen Choice Awards outfit from around that time.
Incredible.
Iconic.
Can't wait for the visuals on that.
And you know, James, it's interesting. It's an interesting one because Silent Hill 2 is a game with multiple endings, and you can interact with Maria in different ways. But I think in a lot of ways, James thinks that he can protect Maria, or tries to be this protector figure for Maria, but is unable to protect her. She's kind of killed several times by Pyramid Head, and then eventually we, you know, find out that James killed Mary, and that kind of reframes this seeing Maria die over and over again, because James is actually the one who is responsible for killing her, but he wants to rewrite the narrative so that he can kind of save her. But then it's also kind of like a version of his wife that is healthier, which is kind of where the disability politics comes in, or she seems to be healthier, ... and also sluttier, like more sexual, more explicitly sexual. And so it's very Lost Highway in that way, right? Like the two versions of kind of Mary and Maria really reminds me of Patricia Arquette, Lost Highway. And of course, James has killed his wife, like Fred killed his wife, and has kind of suppressed that, but is so haunted by his own guilt. And Lost Highway, you were kind of saying when you watched it the other day, Charlotte, that it kind of feels like the most horror-like of Lynch's films, and I would agree with that. It's so unsettling to me. I guess
horror in the classic sense, because I think most of Lynch's work has aspects of horror, but I think so for context, I used to not be a horror film person. Like, I couldn't watch them, I got really stressed. The ones that I did watch, even like your kind of campy silly ones like Final Destination, would freak me out for weeks. This was when I was a teenager, and I'd see them at like sleepovers. Like, there are a couple of sleepovers that I vividly remember like not being able to sleep for like a couple of days afterwards, like because I was just so freaked out by like some of the concepts of some of the films I'd watched. So more recently, in the last few years, I've become, you know, a little bit more open to horror, and I've been watching kind of more horror films and expanding my palette a little bit, and, you know, not feeling that same fear in the same way. So I'm quite interested in like what makes a horror film, because I think there's so much, especially kind of more recent examples of horror that are not like what I guess I imagined of horror when I was a teenager. Like, when I thought of horror as a teenager, I was thinking like slasher films, like zombie films, like the very kind of like, even like some classic kind of like vampire film, you know, like I was kind of thinking about these very like, I guess, supernatural ideas of horror, but also the kind of classic slasher like kind of functionality of like a Halloween or a, you know, like a Nightmare on Elm Street and things like that, which are some of the things that I did end up watching in sleepovers, and still I'm a little bit scarred by, just because my imagination was so overactive at the time that I just couldn't switch off from it. So I think it was interesting watching Lost Highway, because yeah, it did feel a lot more classically horror in that sense. It wasn't like, you know, an Ari Aster film, which is horror, but a very different kind of horror to what I'd initially imagined as horror, and was kind of my easing into the horror genre a bit more, because yes, what you see is horrific, but it's not, I guess, all the things that I'd imagined of the genre when I was younger. But I think with Lost Highway, the things that really stood out to me, I guess, was the character. I think he's just called the Stranger, or just like, I can't remember what he's actually called within the script. The Mystery Man, that's it. He, to me, feels really vampiric, and I mean, fascinatingly, like, this is probably known by a lot of people, but in case people don't know, the guy who played the Mystery Man a few years after the film was made was convicted of murdering his wife, which,
on a podcast as well,
yeah,
I was so creeped out by that.
It's really creepy. And like, this man, I mean, again, I don't want to like converge actor and character, because I mean, I think I'm not even going to get into that, but like, he's fucking creepy the second he's on screen, right? Like, instantly you're like, I am unsettled by this man's presence. It doesn't need to have that wider context. It obviously does have that wider context, which doesn't help, but he just looks menacing, but he also looks very much like a kind of classic Dracula vampire. And there are some kind of allusions during the film to, like, he needs to be invited in, or like he kind of says things that kind of imply something about like vampire lore a little bit. But also I thought that when the transformation happens from Fred to Pete, it kind of really made me think of like classic werewolf films, like the kind of violent transformations that you get in werewolf films. A werewolf is often like, it's someone who can transform into a more powerful creature, right? Or something more powerful, more dangerous. So it's interesting that Fred like kind of transforms into what he views as something more powerful, which is a younger version of him who has more, you know, who is not in prison, or doesn't have to be in prison.
And it's also, I think it's implied that he's like a lot more, has a lot more sexual prowess. Because,
definitely.
Well, I guess that just reminds me of Silent Hill 2 as well, because of like the implication that like, I don't know, it's funny, a lot of people really like resent some of the like readings about sex in Silent Hill, but there is so much like sex in Silent Hill 2. And it's I think in a lot of ways the idea that Maria is a more sexual version of James's wife cannot be a coincidence.
Yeah, 100%.
But in the same way that like Pete is a version of Fred that has more sexual prowess, like he's having sex like all the time.
Yeah,
whereas
like he has
you
this
have that
girlfriend who's like lives near him, and then he obviously has I can't remember Patricia Arquette's character in that form, but Patricia Arquette, Alice, there we go. He has Alice. You know, he has this kind of power that Fred doesn't feel like he has, even if he does have, obviously. And also, he's obviously lost this connection to his wife, and then kills her for what, and through kind of this feeling of jealous. I mean, it's never obviously exactly explained, but I think there's kind of this sense of like discontentment and like fear that she's cheating on him, and also just a kind of sense of his own disillusionment, I guess, with his marriage and his life and his, you know, he's not a successful jazz player, he's not like, you know, he's not successful, his marriage isn't successful, like he's not where he wants to be, and he doesn't feel like he's like really fulfilling his role as a man. And this is, I guess, the things that I infer from why he does it. But yeah.
Yeah. I think, so do you know about the O.J. Simpson connection?
I do, yeah, but it might be a good one to explain, Sarah, if you wanted to.
So it's, I think that David Lynch has stated explicitly in interviews, like one of the only things that he will say about Lost Highway is that one of the inspirations was the OJ trial. And I think he says something like, I just like, you know, I was, you know, I guess like shocked or kind of like trying to think like what would make a man like kill his own wife, like what could make a person do something like that. I think that's interesting. When I first heard it, something I thought about was, thank God that David Lynch didn't make the Fred character a black man, because I don't think he would have had the range.
So true. Oh my God.
I don't think he would have. Yeah, he would not have had the range to deal with like the racial complexities of the OJ trial. But as it stands,
thank God for his unconscious bias, like working in his favor in this one instance.
I know, right?
It made points one time. God.
Yeah.
Oof.
But yeah, so I guess that like Maria being a more sexual version of Mary is kind of like, how could you not interpret that as like one of the things that James resents about Mary becoming disabled is that he can't have sex with her anymore. Like, I know people hate to hear this, but but it's true.
Well, I was just going to say, this is like the thing is, I think you kind of came into Silent Hill in a similar way to me, Sarah, in that when I first started playing these games, I didn't have the context of fandom interpretations of discussions around them. I was just kind of playing them isolated from that. And then I was like, oh yeah, you know, like the nurses, they're obviously like, James, you know, wanted to get his rocks off while his dying wife is right next to him, and he's sexually frustrated. And then you hear about all these opinions that suppose Silent Hill fans, where it's like, nah, that's not it, that's it, it's a different thing. I was like, what have you got to offer here? What else do you think it could be?
Please tell me what your better interpretation is, and where
which I'm open
exactly
to.
The evidence is, which I am open to, but then people will just be like, no, I absolutely disagree with that, and then they won't like, there's no compelling.
Can you elaborate? No.
No.
Yeah.
Which, you know, what I was going to say is, it's obviously, I guess we know in terms of wider context as well about the statistics of, you know, men not wanting to care, not sticking around to care for their wives who are sick, but, you know, many women sticking around for their husbands who are sick. And that kind of like refusal from a lot of men to take on that caring role, and often will leave their partner in various states of like financial, I don't know, nothingness, in order to just, you know, go and fuck someone else and, you know, move on and live their lives very selfishly. Whereas like often women do not do that. Obviously there are exceptions, but most of the time they do not do that. They usually stand by their partner while they're ill.
Yeah, and I guess it's gender in relation to disability, that like women's role in society is conditioned to be, you know, like caring for men and caring for children, and I don't know, it feels that somehow James feels like emasculated and resentful of having to like care for somebody, right, which is so fucked up. But as you say, it's like a very real issue, like facing disabled women.
And also crucially, we see James not caring about most people in the game, so
yeah, so true. It's interesting because I was thinking about, and I guess again in relation to like Fred/Pete, it's like with Maria, with Maria and Angela in particular, it seems like there's part of him that wants to kind of like act like, or think of himself as like a kind of savior figure. Like he half-assedly tries to stop Angela from killing herself.
Don't kill yourself, you're so sexy. Aha.
Exactly. He like half-assedly tries to protect Maria, and not only does he like fail, but also it's because he doesn't really care that much. Like in a lot of these scenes, you don't see him like engaging with them as human beings or like trying to get to know them as people. He's just doing a half-assed job. So it's like he wants to see himself as a savior, but does he actually want to engage with a woman as a person? No.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And I guess, so I think that it would be cool to talk about some other games perhaps in relation to kind of like the patriarchal themes of Lynch, but one kind of thought I had on Silent Hill 2 and why it works so well for me is that, like, I don't know, for me personally, I kind of think Silent Hill 2 is like, it looms large in my mind as like one of the like best games there is that like achieves this kind of like Lynchian vibe while also being entirely its own like brilliant thing, because not just because of the themes that we've talked about, but because it is so seamlessly dreamlike. It's like the dream logic of it and the way that the dreaminess of it kind of like weaves this very like symbolic narrative about power that really makes you think to get it. I think that in a lot of ways that's kind of like in my opinion it's just one of the best games at doing that, because I think some games are like, I don't know, they're like weird without any intention, like, you know, it's like weird with no purpose, or it's like doing the Twin Peaks thing but there's no surrealism, like Deadly Premonition at like doing an absolutely shit job of all of the above, you know.
Or but lest Silent we forget Life is Strange Double Exposure.
Oh my god, yeah. So for me, like, Silent Hill 2 is kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of the Lynchian game, in my opinion.
Like, I really, really resonate with that, and in particular, I think I can't remember which one of you said something about how the way that Life is Strange starts out with the like kind of the dream, and was it Chloe who just like goes along with it because that's dream logic.
Max,
I think that
yeah.
Max. I think that's very much present in Silent Hill, the series as a whole as well.
Yeah. Where
characters are very often not particularly reactive to the things that they are experiencing, and even when they are, it's like so subdued. Like, you haven't played Silent Hill 4 yet, Sarah, and I'll avoid spoilers on that one for your sake there, but the protagonist in that game, Henry, there are so many times where he just goes, what the hell? And like, that's it. Like, it's real low-key kind of reactions to these things, and they just kind of press on because of, I think, the fact that there's a chance that these characters believe that they are experiencing a dream right now, because it is such a surreal experience where it's like, well, I guess I just got to do the next thing.
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't make sense, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you're following the rhythm of the world that is presented to you, and I think that's really interesting in terms of Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill again, just in general, and how you switch between Silent Hill itself and Fogworld and Otherworld, which are all like very lore-heavy things, but they are still like textually interesting things to happen, and how the world changes and you get a different perspective on it because of the literal transition between different realms of existence, I guess.
I think that's so interesting in terms of like thinking about video games as like a format as well, because I feel like there's so many games that you play where you kind of drop in and you don't really have context for what's going on. It's like, you know, you're in the tutorial level, or you're just starting the game and you're like, okay, some shit's happened, or some shit's about to go down or something, but I don't know what it is yet. And you go straight to your like objectives and you just go, okay, what are my objectives, you know? And that's almost like that dream logic as well, of like, I know what my objective is, so I can just barrel ahead and figure this out later, almost.
Yeah,
like this isn't mattering too much to me right now.
I was just going to say, like both in games and in dreams, most of the time you don't really have a choice in the actions that you're taking. Like, there is an illusion of free will in the sense that you can choose to... I mean, in Silent Hill 2, the game is reactive to the choices that you make, so it's a slight kind of, like, subversion of that. But ultimately, the main kind of plot beats are the same. Like, they're always the same, it's just kind of the ending that changes. You just have to follow what is happening. And in a dream, unless you are a particularly good lucid dreamer, you just have to follow what is happening. Unless you, like... Again, unless you're a good lucid dreamer and you have an amount of self-awareness, but even then, controlling dreams is an incredibly hard thing to do.
Yeah, 100%. I think, Silent Hill 2 is, and Silent Hill in general, definitely, like, up there for me. And I guess I've probably already implied this, but I do also feel that next on that list, I think Life is Strange really does a lot of this stuff so well. Like, sometimes I think about episode 5 in particular. It's just so fucking good. Like, honestly, life-changing, like, paradigm-shifting for me personally at 18 years old.
Yeah. And I mean, even like in subsequent playthroughs where we've kind of obviously you've gone through, like, you know, the bit with the lighthouse and you've got the light on you and you're trying to avoid all these creepy men, and like we've obviously, you know, kind of discussed the reinterpretation of like that's Max's sexuality. You know, she is a lesbian and her biggest threat is these men wanting things from her all the time, and like the kind of perception of men is her like biggest fear almost. And it's so beautifully metaphorical, but it also does not explain itself at all, and it's entirely what you can infer from it. But it's so fucking good. It's just great.
Which might be if you guys feel good about this, an interesting segue into, like, we can kind of keep talking about patriarchy a bit, but also connected to that, the propaganda and true crime stuff. And it's really your time to shine now, Charlotte.
Hey, I am here.
But
I'm locked in.
I guess, you know, of course, in particular with Twin Peaks, but I guess somewhat in some of the other works. David Lynch loves cops.
He fucking loves cops.
He really loves cops. It's bad.
Yeah.
And, I think, you know, I see a lot of people kind of saying that the detective in Lynch's work is often like a detective of meaning and like of the unknown. And I'm like, okay, but you can do that without doing propaganda. Case in point, actually, Life is Strange, where you are a teenage girl Nancy Drew vibe and not a cop, right?
Yeah. And I think there's something so interesting about the fact that, like, and I mean, I also, you know, we will probably maybe in this section talk a little bit about Jenny LeClue as well. Like, I got very into this idea. I also played some Nancy Drew games probably like last year on stream as well. And there is this idea of, like, obviously the girl detective is like a trope in narratives, right? And I think that it lends itself well to a video game, of course, and it's often like a video game aimed at younger girls as well. But I think it's also quite an interesting choice in terms of like the politics of it, because often these teenage girls operate completely outside, of course, of the police force, and they are often like, I mean, I think Jenny LeClue is a great example of this. Like, she is like very much positioned as like anti-cop. Like, it's almost like she's been brought up to learn how to be a detective, but she is against her grandfather, who is like the chief of police. She like literally is doing all of this against his interests. Like, all of the things that she's been taught and told throughout her whole childhood have been about like how to be a detective, but it's not been about how to be a cop and how to use the detecting skills for like the justice system. It's about using it to discover truth and find justice in different ways. And I think that's really interesting, but also in terms of just like uncovering truths to understand her world and like understanding the world around her in a world where she doesn't have any power. And I think that's what really ties into the teenage girl kind of genre, and that, like, you know, often teenage girls, and I mean, we also will discuss the fact it's usually white teenage girls, are not empowered. They are not given power within society. They are usually looked upon. They are, analysed through other people's eyes. They are not given their own narratives or their own kind of power. And I think there's something really interesting about, like, the idea of someone with no power trying to uncover truths that are usually buried by people in power. And often the reason for these kind of teenage girl detective stories are where, they're pointing out the issues with the police force, and they are pointing out that this structure is unsound and it is not a good structure, because, how can all of these things get buried? How can all of these things, like, not come to light? And the reason is usually because someone's being paid off, or because men are men and a lot of men are in the police force, or, there's all these different reasons. But it also often comes out of something for, like, teenage girls to feel some kind of power and agency. And I think there's this amazing scene in Jenny LeClue, which I do have a copy of, which I will be probably using in this video, where she confronts her mum. She finally finds her mum. There's this whole storyline. Basically, her mum has gone missing, and the principal of the university that her mum teaches at has died. And loads of people, like the cops, think that it was her mum who killed him, basically. And she's desperately trying to find her mum, and she's been taught her whole life by her mum, who is like it's never really clear, like, just kind of teaches people how to be a detective, but, like, may or may not be associated with the actual police force, not entirely sure. But Jenny has been brought up her whole life to kind of learn how to be a detective, basically, or how to, like, deduce things from evidence. And she manages to find her mum despite, so many obstacles in her way, and including, like, risking her own life in order to find her mum. And she comes to her mum with, like, this theory that she has about what's actually happened. And her mum just outright dismisses her and is like, no, go home. Like, you shouldn't be here. But it's this complete antithesis of everything she's been brought up to do, right? She's been told her whole life, this is how you do this thing. This is what you should aspire to. And it's this moment of, like, complete disillusionment with, like, the structures that she's been told to, like, honour. And the fact that her own mother is telling her that she shouldn't be doing this, even though her whole life she's been told she should be doing this. And it's this real, like, kind of rug being pulled from under her feet of, like, she thought she had this power because she found the truth, but she's learning that having the truth actually isn't powerful necessarily. It's just this huge moment that I think is really interesting, and it's in conversation with kind of propaganda. I don't know that the game itself doesn't quite figure out its views on that, and I will say also it's part 1 of a game that does not yet have a part 2, so you never know, maybe if the part 2 ever gets made, they'll have a little bit more explanation or more interrogation of that. But I think crucially, Jenny's position as, like, she's not even, I don't think she's even a teenager, I think she's like 12, as this kind of this kid, she's not being given any agency in this, but she's also, like, she is, like, the only one who can seem to see the issues because she's the only one looking for them. And I think there's something in there about, like, when we talk about, like, Twin Peaks, for instance, and we talk about Dale Cooper, he kind of initially is introduced as a man who almost has these, like, supernatural deduction powers, right? It's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes-esque thing, almost, of, like, he can just magically deduce these things. He's just so super perceptive. And it starts like that, but I wouldn't say it continues like that. I think there are definitely points, especially towards kind of the reveal of the killer and everything, where Cooper's really not doing that anymore. And I don't know, there's something very interesting about that to me, but I don't know, maybe someone else will have something else more to say on that topic.
It's an interesting one because I think that, I guess, like, I was just thinking about how, like, David Lynch talks so much about intuition, and I think that something that I always think about with Dale Cooper is how he uses his intuition and he uses dreams, and he uses completely non-traditional and in a lot of ways antithetical to this kind of like Western rationalist idea of what it means to kind of like detect or investigate or come to knowledge. He kind of taps into like intuitions, dreams, things like that to come to knowledge, and the knowledge that he comes to is like, you know, in a sense it's like logical, rational knowledge, who killed Laura Palmer, but in a sense it's a deeper kind of more philosophical and political knowledge, which is, why did Laura Palmer die?
Yeah.
And that's what's so good about Twin Peaks. But unfortunately, in exploring those themes through a character who, at the end of the day, is an FBI agent, it's still propaganda, because the FBI is entirely presented as like a benevolent force that kind of like tries to, you know, seek truth and protect people. That is not obviously the truth of the FBI, which is an organization that seeks to protect corporate interests and repress political movements. But I think that feels like, I don't know, that feels like kind of what I think when it comes to Dale Cooper. But you know, something that always strikes me in the pilot episode of Twin Peaks is that scene where Dale and Harry are in the hospital and Ronette Pulaski is in the hospital. He wants to interview Ronette Pulaski, and the girl is, you know, she's just been like sexually assaulted and like is on her deathbed. And Dale Cooper shows up and is like, can I interview her? Can I interview her? Like, and he's like leaning over the bed and just being like, hey Ronette, can you tell me this and that and the other? And it's such cop behavior. And every time I rewatch that pilot, I'm so struck by that scene, because so many people think, oh, this character is like a perfect cinnamon roll. But like it's in the pilot episode, and every time I watch it, it's like chilling to me, because how could you treat her that way? So I do think that even though all of what I said is true, I think that there's a strange coldness to Dale sometimes, that is cop-like.
Do you know what I kind of find interesting about that, in terms of like how Twin Peaks kind of has that loop of propaganda, is that I feel like that is a very specific choice to make Dale feel like this kind of like slightly cold and like what is he doing to this poor girl that has just been through the worst events in the world. And then the town, and subsequently like Harry and the rest of the police department, kind of soften him to like their small town ways of doing police work. But it's again like that's still propaganda. Like it might be a quieter version of it, but that's perhaps more insidious, that they're becoming more like, I've forgotten his name now. The silly tall one. What's his name?
Andy.
Yeah, Andy. I love Andy. Hilarious character. Genuinely some like wonderful emotional moments. He's still a cop, and like it's still that thing of you know, you're being warmed up to him, but it's like, well, okay, but even in that scenario where we're trying to like him, you're still presenting an idea that it's fine and maybe even good that we have a cop that is emotional and cries over things to do with crimes, when it's like, even in the act of service he is supposedly meant to do that is supposedly good for us, he is failing to do that. So it's still like a different kind of propaganda. It's just kind of there wall to wall in different ways, in different weird ways.
There's a particular moment that has actually come up quite a lot in this podcast I've been listening to, which is kind of like a Twin Peaks recap podcast called The Detective and the Log Lady. But one of my favourite things that they keep pointing out is that when Dale Cooper like first talks to the log lady, she says like, my log saw something that night. And despite the fact we've been introduced to him as someone who, is this intuitive thinker, like seems to really like have a lot of stock in like dreams and the mystical, doesn't want to hear what the log has to say. And it's like,
so true.
You know what? Yeah, like that's so true. Like I think about that a lot now, because I'm like, this is a man who, we've been told all these things, but that this woman comes to him and she's like, this is my log, he's got something to say to you. He's like, nah, I don't want to hear it. It's like, all right.
And does the logs always right? It's probably out of the scope of this podcast to get too deep into Dale Cooper's Tibet obsession and kind of the politics of Tibet. But that is also a whole thing. I think, so in relation to a lot of the games that are inspired by Twin Peaks, a lot of them have like a cop character, often a playable cop character. You have Control, because the FBC is kind of like an FBI parallel. Disco Elysium, and I do want to talk about Disco Elysium because I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of like is Disco Elysium propaganda, question mark. What else? Alan Wake 2, Deadly Premonition, where it's like literally a Dale Cooper knockoff character. So like quite a lot of these games like have playable cop characters.
Oh right, yeah. No, you're not wrong at all. I think it's like it is such, the procedural, the like crime procedural is such a staple genre. Like people always like, oh, the greatest TV show of all time, The Wire, which a show I have not seen. Maybe I'll watch it one day. I don't give a shit. When people overhype stuff that much, you kind of want to pull away from it. But I think it's kind of like, it's sort of to do with what Charlotte or Sarah, I can't remember now, we're talking about, but like it's an interesting perspective to have, because it is a character who doesn't know things and their whole deal is to search out for answers, and that's like a really great hook. And I don't even think like having cop or cop-like protagonists is a bad thing. It just needs to be self-aware in that way, which is like where that question of Disco Elysium comes into it, whether it is propaganda or not. I think it's kind of interesting to some of your frustrations, Sarah, with Control and how it ends. And if you want to speak to that, so I'm not speaking for you.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. So Control is a game that in a lot of ways I really loved, and then I kind of think that the whole experience was soured for me by the end, which is like a huge shame, because it's like, well, I guess that the premise was so intriguing to me in a way, because in Control you don't start out as an FBC agent in any way, shape or form. You actually start out in quite an antagonistic position to the FBC. You play this character Jessie, who is looking for her brother, who essentially was kidnapped by the FBC, or Federal Bureau of Control, which is a governmental organization that works to essentially like research and contain and control all paranatural forces. I think that and in terms of my frustrations with the end and the propaganda element, it's that Control kind of ultimately culminates in, the game starts with Jessie shows up at the FBC kind of building, the oldest house, and finds herself assigned against her will the role of director of the FBC, because of this kind of like supernatural force that always chooses the director. She decides to use this position to her advantage so that she can find her brother, but then by the end of the game she really ends up like aligning with the FBC, which like throughout the game kind of like offers countless kind of ways of understanding that the FBC is a fundamentally like violent organization, but the kind of way that it ends is like incredibly reformist. It's like the game ends with Jessie and like various other women characters, for example Emily, displacing the white male kind of leaders of the organization that were there before, so the head of research and the director, and being like, oh, well, we can change it from like the inside. And it's like, no, I mean, what you've told me throughout this entire game is that this organization like exists to do something fundamentally violent, which is to control paranatural forces, to keep it away from ordinary people so that they don't have access to that power, and also to keep it away from foreign nations, and like the nations that they name are literally communist nations, so Cuba and the USSR, which is so parallel to like the way that the FBI functions in real life, which is that it exists to suppress domestic political movements that are usually socialist or communist in nature. So for example, the FBI famously assassinated Fred Hampton or various other Black Panthers, because they were like out to suppress this like radical socialist Black liberation movement. And there are countless examples of that being the mission of the FBI. They do not want us, the ordinary people, or I should say Americans, because we're not Americans, to have power or autonomy over their own lives. They exist to protect corporate and governmental interests, and they also, in conjunction with the CIA being the international branch, are kind of to suppress communism and socialism abroad. So the FBC kind of like works in the same way as the FBI, but like in a paranatural way. It's like keeping paranatural power away from the people. And it does, various like immoral, like deeply troubling things, like kidnapping children and grooming children and gaslighting people and doing all sorts of like shady shit. And then at the end, it's like, well, if we just had a white woman in charge, then everything will be fine.
Girl boss feminism won't save us. You'll be shocked to hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's I guess, before I pass it on to Fia, because this is also a game that you've played, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on this topic. One of the other things I've been thinking about a lot in relation to Control is that some of the kind of like strangeness or surreal elements of it are really cool, but then by the end of the game I find them, and this is kind of a problem I have with Alan Wake as well, so it might be a wider Remedy thing, I find them to be over-explained or over-rationalized. Like, I get kind of like annoyed by how much stuff is kind of like explained through lore documents. I'm like, oh, I wanted some kind of like sense of mystery. And I think that the kind of like, I guess that Control is also kind of inspired more by like SCP and that kind of stuff, but it's like, yeah, so I feel that in that sense it kind of like loses a Lynchian quality for me. But I mean, the propaganda is pretty Lynchian.
So the reason I'm like, I would be hesitant to outright say the Control is completely propaganda, I think obviously it has elements of it as you described, is a thing that you and I talked about a little bit a while ago, in how the issue is that it ends like a season of television. Like, it ends on a cliffhanger, so to speak, of there is more to come. There's an implication of more to come, which you've expressed to me, how, there's the problems of kind of like cinematic universe building that you find within like Marvel films, and how that doesn't exactly work.
Yeah, I think so. I guess that my and it's okay if we disagree on this, but my feeling on it is like, the more that I play like Remedy cinematic universe games, the more that I'm like, the game ends in a way that I don't like, and then because I know that it's part of a wider universe, I'm like, okay, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and see what happens in the next one. But increasingly I've found myself being like, okay, no, I think I'm just going to take this as its own thing, and if I take it as its own thing, then Control is propaganda.
I was going to say as well, just quickly, like, I mean, this is not a question we're necessarily going to answer here, but like, is there such thing as a game or any kind of story that has police in it, like, or it has police as like, or kind of cop roles as main characters, that isn't a kind of propaganda?
That's a question we'll come back to with Disco Elysium, I think.
Well, because you were talking about Disco Elysium as well, I was like, because I've only seen a little snippet of Sarah playing it, and I am very interested in like how it would not be, because in my experience, most things that have cops as like kind of main characters do fall into the basic trappings of propaganda. Like it just kind of it does, because you're empathizing with a cop, so yeah, I'm intrigued.
I'll come to that in a second, because I want to finish my thought.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
In that, I think you're right, Sarah, in that viewing Control as an isolated thing on its own, as just one game, as not part of a bigger whole. Yes, the way that it ends is just kind of like, it like, if you view it as a singular movie, if we're making that kind of comparative term almost, it would be troubling in its messaging. But the thing is, like, Remedy is in its structure of its games, at the very least, is much more inspired by television, and so it feels like the end of a season. But again, I think I spoke about this with you. The reason that doesn't quite work as a structure is that at the end of Control, when you become in control as the new director, you can continue to just play the game and wrap up any side quests that you miss out on. in this new role as director. So like it shapes and twists the narrative in such a way, like it's a problem that it doesn't just end conclusively, or at least like how there are certain games where, you know, you beat the final boss and then it puts you back to before the final boss. Like that would maybe make more sense for Control, in that it's a much more like cleanly defined ending, leaving you wanting to know more. Could still potentially be troubling, but there's like it's like, no, this is the end, whereas in the way it actually is that you can just keep playing, and so it doesn't really answer the questions of exactly what it's trying to say. And I think it's also kind of a little bit important to view like Control and Alan Wake as separate but connected. I think that's important in terms of the Remedy connected universe rather than cinematic. Like they're connected but not as part of a whole necessarily. It's like Control is one television show, Alan Wake is another. They have crossover elements here and there, but they're not necessarily the exact same thing, and they might cross paths occasionally. But I imagine Control 2 will do a lot of its own things, which is in the works. They are working on it. I'm not going to outright say I think Remedy are going to do Control 2 perfectly, because while I think Alan Wake 2 does reflect upon its own legacy in the original game, it also does things worse in some way, because now you're playing as a cop-like figure in Saga Anderson, which is maybe slightly problematic in that she's a black woman, and like, what does that say about these things? Like, is it girl boss feminism? A little bit, I think. But yeah, I think I think with Control, it's an issue of games as a medium and how the medium shapes the message in unintended ways.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that potentially being, I guess, like too much of an approach that's like, I'm inspired by television and I'm trying to do the television thing, when it's like, okay, I mean, you are making a video game, so maybe
try to understand that form more.
Yeah.
Which I think they're also...
Sorry.
I was just going to say, which I also think they are, like, they very much lean into being video games in very interesting ways, but then, like, in terms of narrative structure, can sometimes fall apart a little bit. But yeah, go on.
No, I was going to say, should we go to Charlotte's question in Disco Elysium?
I think so. A complicated, difficult question that I'm sure nobody will have any opinions on.
I just like to bring ideas to the table and then just drop them and run away.
No,
yeah,
I love it.
Thank you.
It's I love a provocation. Disco Elysium, it's pretty fresh in my mind because I played it like a few months ago, and so Disco Elysium is made by the Estonian studio Zaum. Anyone who's played it and knows about Zaum knows about kind of the incredibly complicated trappings of the studio structure, which we're not going to go into in tons of detail right now. But the original creators of Zaum and original creatives working on Disco Elysium were have kind of like, you know, said explicitly that they are communists. They have, you know, previously been part of like anarchist groups. So they are very much kind of like on the far left. I'm not going to say comrades because of, again, some of the complicated, more complicated elements of like what those guys have been up to. But so we know going into this game, right, that the creators have those political leanings. And one of the kind of elements of Disco Elysium is that, so it has the very Lynchian quality of you kind of like wake up and you don't know who you are, Mulholland Drive core. You quickly find out that you are a police officer with horrible depression and drinking problem, who is in this place, Revachol, to investigate a murder. And as the game progresses, you learn a lot about the world of Elysium, which is kind of a fantasy world, and like the politics of that world. The main plot line in relation to the murder ends up kind of deeply being entrenched within the local dock workers union. So essentially this main plot about this kind of one murder and the man who has been killed is a private security officer hired by the company that employs the dock workers and wants to break the strike, which is ongoing. So there are like a lot of complex, really interesting class politics going on in Disco Elysium, and it's essentially a game about like you trying to investigate a murder and potentially a class war being on the horizon in Revachol. So it's dope, right? But and you as a character can, in various ways throughout the game, express your political allegiances. When I was playing Disco Elysium, I would tend towards choosing the more kind of like communist leaning kind of like political opinions, obviously, because I'm a communist. But something that would often come through in interactions with characters is that you would say something that like a communist might say, and then they would call you out because you're a police officer. So the game would often explicitly say, the game would often explicitly be like, you say you're a communist, but police officers are protectors of the state and capital, so how could you be a communist?
Interesting.
I think an important point to bring up there is like how this is, because of like the amnesia thing, is how you are shaping this cop character who is maybe not entirely aware of the role that they have within like systems of oppression, because like he is trying to figure these things out, and through you is refiguring out his politics through regaining his memory. And there is that kind of like push and pull of, as you say, he is a cop, but like you as a character, as a player role playing him, because it has strong roots in tabletop role playing games, is what's like what is the difference between you and this cop? Like you need to figure it out as well. And then, like you say, it pushes back on that.
I do remember, like, and I don't know how much we've talked about Disco Elysium, Fia, so I'd be super curious to kind of hear your thoughts on this. I do remember, like, the end of Disco Elysium, I was kind of like, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about all of this, because while, the game kind of, like, offers a lot of this, like, pushback, and it kind of confronts you with the idea that, like, a cop can't be a communist, like... you do fundamentally have to solve this murder, and that means finding the individual who is responsible. Meanwhile, throughout the entire game, you're kind of, it's from a very abolitionist perspective in a lot of ways, understanding more and more about the systems that led to this individual killing, and how like an individual can't really be held responsible for crime, if that makes sense. And the person who did it is basically someone who used to be a soldier of the kind of communist group that led the failed world revolution in Revachol, and then was persecuted. And he deserted the communist army, and he eventually, kind of like riddled with guilt and cynicism about the possibility of bringing about world revolution, he kind of sets up his like lonely little world on this island where he kind of like watches the people of Revachol, and one day he decides to murder this private security guard, because I mean he is his class enemy, so it's like I don't necessarily disagree with what he's doing, but he's a complicated character in a lot of ways, but you as the player, solving the murder means putting this man in prison, right? Because you're a police officer.
Yeah, of course.
And so the end of the game is like quite tricky when it comes to that, because I'm like, okay, you've played the game and you've done the fun video game thing, which is finding the solution to this mystery. But now, even though I agree with potentially with the political motivations of this man, now he has to be punished for what he did, whether or not I agree with that, because I'm playing as a cop. And part of the ending of the game as well is kind of like the other police officers from the precinct kind of showing up and taking this and kind of like helping with taking this man away and taking the case forward. So it's a difficult ending in that sense, and I'm not really 100% sure what to make of it, which again is why I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that, Fia.
I think I think that Disco Elysium is a game that trusts the people that are playing it. Because I think there is a real thing in a lot of games where, I mean, I can't remember, like just the other day we spoke about, you know, the whole yellow paint thing in games, which are like, people are being guided in very specific ways and handheld. And Disco Elysium does not do that. And I think because of the examination that it has with so much of ideas around institutions and systems that are there that pretty much just solely oppress people, whether they be the police force or you know, local government or anything like this, and the roles that unions have in providing better working conditions and things like that, all these things that it explores. I think it would have been a disservice if like they kind of provided an easy answer to it. Like, I think it's like, yeah, there's an ideal scenario in here, but even if you as one single cop could like decide, well, no, I don't want this person to go to prison, that you're not like strong or powerful enough to change the systems. Like, the systems still exist in this world. And so I guess it would be a very different game if it was trying to create a utopia in that way. Like, if you're working towards a utopia, if you were the communist who is trying to bring about world revolution, like that would be a thing worth doing potentially, but it's also not the game.
Yeah, no, I think I really resonate with that, because something I was really grappling with while playing Disco Elysium is like, do I feel like this game is too cynical about communism? Because I think that game explores a huge amount of like incredibly valid and important critiques of like of leftists, and that was something I was grappling with throughout until I finished the Communist Quest, which actually had such a note of hope for me, because in the Communist Quest it says that your objective is to build 0.001% of communism. And the quest ends with you joining a communist reading group, and it basically being like, well, you found fellow communists, and that's something, and you go from there. And that was so beautiful and so hopeful to me in a strange way. And so I think I really resonate with what you're saying about not having easy answers, right? Because in a lot of ways, it's like, if I, the player, am engaging with Disco Elysium from the perspective of wanting to build 0.001% of communism, I am also grappling with my own history and my own complicity as this character, Harry Dubois. He's trying to create a new life and a new identity for himself, but he can't escape the life that he had before, and which is still attached to him in some way because he's still a cop. So in a lot of ways, those tensions are like, yeah, they're difficult to read, but I kind of love that. So it is really hard to say that Disco Elysium is propaganda. Like, I don't think I would say that. I think
it's also a flaw in the work, because I have seen people on the political spectrum who would not identify as left. I don't know if they would identify as anything further than centre, but very like centre right. But I think there are some right-wing people who think that it is a game that absolutely hates communism and thinks that like leftist ideology is the worst thing to ever exist. And
this is what I was going to say. Like, is this a game where it does reflect like the politics you have? And
well, this is always the risk of trusting the player, isn't it? Or trusting the viewer, or trusting the reader. Like, David Lynch trusted the viewer, right? And I guess that this is kind of what it is. It's like there's always a risk that comes with trusting people to engage with the work on its own terms. But I think that I kind of admire that Disco Elysium does that.
And I think to tie it back into David Lynch once again, because talking about games, let's bring back Twin Peaks into it. With The Return, you and me, Sarah, have had a conversation about the ending of The Return and how I think I came away a little bit more positive on like the representation of propaganda, and how I think I personally think the ending is a reflection upon the propaganda in the original show. It's again completely fine if you don't, because I don't think that The Return does quite enough to get there, but I do think it's what the attempt that was made, because of how much of a refusal The Return it just doesn't give you the Dale Cooper that you want. That, like, again, this like little cinnamon roll, as you referred to him earlier, Sarah, obviously sarcastically, but that is how people treat him. And then The Return just does not give you that for like 20 episodes, basically. Like, it's a long time, and then, you know, they're long episodes, and then when you finally get him, he is a different Dale Cooper than you remember or are used to. He is a lot more explicitly insidious.
Well, yeah, we kind of get a little blip of him and then immediately pretty much get that taken away. So, yeah. But I think what I thought about The Return, because I've been kind of letting that cook, I finished it quite recently. I definitely think it, for me, I mean, we talked a bit more about like the self-awareness of Lynch earlier. I think The Return really kind of hammered home a self-awareness that I think he really he wanted to really play with those, like, not just audience expectations, but like audience theories and what audiences feel about Cooper and about Gordon Cole and about like all these different characters, especially the ones in the FBI. And I think, yeah, he definitely doesn't necessarily give us any answers either way, but I think he definitely is playing with that in a very interesting way. That's my feelings on it anyway.
Yeah. I do agree with you both. I think that with regards to propaganda in The Return, my feeling is that Dale Cooper as a character is unsettled in a way that I really like. But I think that the critique that I would level is that I think that it still leans too hard into that it potentially, because I'm open to disagreement on this, but I think that it potentially leans too hard into the representational idea of criminal equals bad, cop equals good, because bad Cooper is a criminal, you know, and good Cooper is an FBI agent.
Well, I was going to also talk about, like, obviously there are debates as to whether quote unquote bad Cooper is Cooper. You know, they are kind of two entities that are the two halves of the same person, right? And actually the things that bad Cooper does are things that Cooper kind of even at points like sort of expresses wanting to do in some ways, or like, you know, he is aware of that nature, right? And I think there is a point where we do have to say, like, how different are these two actually, and actually are they the same? Yeah, and the same person, you know?
Yeah, the thing is, I totally agree with that. What I mean is that, like, when you kind of like, I guess, use particular types of symbolism, right? Mm-hmm. Like criminality represents evil, or being a member of the police force represents good. I think even if you're kind of like using those symbols in complicated ways, you are still reinforcing the idea that criminality represents evil.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, like in the sense that there's a lot of times where crime, the crime in media, where it's like an extreme version of crime as a way to justify claiming that crime is just bad inherently, when it's like, no, there are actual moral justifications for it. You know, theft of food and sanitary towels is like so fucking justifiable in pretty much every context.
Yeah, 100%, because criminality is kind of a political construct, right? And we're kind of taught that that being a criminal, that crime equals evil, but that's not the case. So yeah,
and it's like, I think our opinions don't technically, like, they're not necessarily like contradictory of each other, where like I do believe that the ending of The Return is a criticism of authority, you know, police-like figures, but there is still not quite enough, like, as you say, a self-reflection on what are the exact definitions of the good and bad things that are happening, because particularly because of like the ending of The Return being so disgustingly sexual. Not like sex isn't bad, just like there is a sexual encounter, and it is deeply uncomfortable, and is the kind of real turning point towards thinking about, okay, is this a Dale Cooper is this the cinnamon roll or not?
Yeah, well, I guess like it comes back to sexual violence against women representing evil in a lot of his work as well, because that's kind of part of how Dale is so deeply unsettled for us, is because of the rape of Diane.
And the potential rape of Audrey, which I think is heavily implied, and I think is confirmed to be, it was meant to be implied, you know. Yeah, definitely. Like, I think there is, like, there's something in there about how Lynch definitely feels like those are kind of the worst acts people can do, but also a kind of weird approach to, like, criminalizing them, in that, you know, when we get, like, the Leland reveal of, like, finding out that Leland is the one who killed Laura, there's obviously this kind of reaction from Leland of, like, you know, Bob kind of really coming out and, like, really, you know, kind of, I guess, performing this evil role, right? And then when Leland dies, it's almost, the discussion becomes like, well, Leland wasn't the person who did this, it was Bob. And it's almost like absolving Leland of what he did. And also because Leland's dead, they don't have to criminalize him. You know what I mean? They don't have to arrest him again, or they don't have to go through a criminal trial or anything. Yeah, and it happens a few times, like in the series, where they kind of avoid having, even when Leland kills Jacques Renault, maybe? Yeah, one of the Renaults. They basically just skip a trial because Sheriff Truman's like, oh, but Leland's great. He's fine. He's
so true.
He's great. Why would we don't need to criminalise him, he's just lost his daughter, you know? And then, of course, we find out he's the one who killed his daughter. You know. But yeah, I think there's a few times the show does that, where it sort of, like, approaches, like, some kind of reckoning with the concept of criminality and morality, and then just sort of doesn't, which is interesting and does feel like a kind of avoidance, I guess.
Yeah,
of, like,
definitely.
Really delving into that topic.
I do get the sense from David Lynch's work that on some level he genuinely, like, believes the idea that, like, the justice system is, like, just, and that, you know, and that criminals face justice and it's deserved, and that, you know, law enforcement is good because they enforce they serve out justice. Like, I get the sense that David Lynch on some level truly believed that.
Yeah, and I think just the avoidance of getting into that is almost that, like, you know, he's kind of like, I just don't want to go there, almost, because he has he doesn't want to even delve into those feelings, maybe, or
it's interesting, because I think that the positives and negatives politically of Lynch are often related to the idea, like, I see a lot of people describing his work as humanist, which is to say that, like, human beings and their emotions and their experiences and their relationships to each other are really, like, at the center of his work, which is part of what I love about his work. I think this is both a strength and a weakness politically, in the sense that a lot of the political themes represented in Lynch's work are done through interpersonal relationships, which, you know, both can be really powerful. Like, for example, when you think about, you know, what Laura Palmer's father did to her, and how everybody kind of, like, failed to support her or see what was happening. That is, you know, a really good example of kind of an interpersonal struggle representing a wider political issue. And you can think about that in Life is Strange, right? Like, what happened to Rachel Amber is kind of like an individual story that represents this much larger social issue to do with kind of, like, power and wealth and so on. But yeah, the limitations of that, right, can be that I don't think that Lynch, you don't get the sense that Lynch thought about some of these, like, you know, broader political issues, like, what is the nature of crime? Do cops really serve us? Etc.
To tie back into Disco Elysium, I think, like, what we were talking about earlier, and how the way that people inspired by his works kind of pick up the slack that he dropped in his works. And I think, again, like Disco Elysium, whether it is a perfect game or not, definitely not, because nothing is, it is still, at the very least, examining these kinds of topics. And I often think that's like more important than getting them right, is at least like when it comes to political themes anyway, is trying to have a conversation with yourself as an artist and the thing that you're expressing in your game, film, TV show, whatever it is, and whether you come out like perfect with it or not. I'm happy to see an amount of reflection as long as it feels honest, which Disco Elysium does. It feels like a very, very honest game. It feels like the writers, putting their feelings, the complicated mess that they are, pen to page and then to sprite video game form. It feels like a work that is messy but truthful.
Yeah, 100%. It's that's kind of like linked to what I was saying earlier about it being cool to see like marginalized people represented in kind of like Lynch inspired work. Disco Elysium is so cool because it's like, what if communists made art inspired by David Lynch, and it had like pretty damn good politics. And I think that the other thing I want to mention as, I guess, like a weakness, and it would be interest of Lynch's work, in my opinion, is a strength and a weakness, is how representational or how symbolic it is. Because, and this is kind of connected to what I was saying with regards to The Return. On one hand, like, approaching things from like an allegorical or symbolic point of view is, I love it. Obviously, I love surrealism. I think that there's kind of almost sometimes, in my opinion, an emotional truth that you can reach through surrealism that is harder to reach through realism. Like, for example, for example, when I watch like Mulholland Drive or Firewalk with Me, like, I've seen other films deal with those topics, but few films have like moved me as much, and it has so much to do with the like surrealist representations of like the emotions and experiences of those characters. It's like it touches something in you that words and logic can't reach. But the trappings of that politically are how symbols can be flattening. So, for example, in Mulholland Drive, there is, obviously that quite creepy scene that it comes up a few times of, the man with the caterpillar eyebrows going behind the Winkies and seeing a homeless person there. And it is somewhat uncomfortable that like a homeless or houseless person is being used here as like a representation of abject horror, like that's troubling.
Which is a similar thing of Silent Hill 2 and the kind of bodies that are presented there, where it's like, it's important in the context of Silent Hill 2, but potentially still troubling.
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of where that ableism comes back in again, I guess, as well, isn't there? That kind of fear of other. And another thing that I've kind of, I think, thought about a bit is, and this is again not something we can necessarily get into here, but there does seem to be this like fear of aging that really runs throughout Lynch's work, and like obviously he loves delving into like teenage, he kind of loves that like teenage melodrama, right? But older people are often depicted as quite scary or threatening or menacing or even just like incomprehensible, which again, this is probably not one for today, but I think that there is something interesting in that. And like his depictions of like absolute horror are often like middle-aged or older people. They are very rarely, if ever, young people. And I mean, obviously that kind of goes again along those like kind of signs and symbols. We think about like the crone and the kind of, I guess, ageist depictions of how we see what evil or threatening things look like. But yeah, I don't know. There's something in there, probably.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, actually. One thing that I think it would be interesting for us to talk about a bit, which we haven't yet, is David Lynch is, I guess a lot of his work is kind of understood as being about America. A lot of the people who were inspired by his work and have made video games inspired by his work have not been American.
I think that is very much because he does not have, but like I think by any sense of the word, like American aesthetical sensibilities. Like when you think of American cinema, despite how like much Americana there is in Lynch's works, it is not the kind of Americana that many, I think, Americans would want to have as representations of themselves, because of how critical it can be and explorative it can be, in a way of, like of in Blue Velvet, and the discomfort that comes from American suburbia in Lost Highway, and you have this kind of like brutalist, almost like, there is a wealth aura quality to the place that they live in. It looks expensive. It looks like they are in some fancy kind of neighbor-ish neighborhood in Hollywood or LA or whatever.
Yeah, it's just to clarify quickly, that's based on David Lynch's own house in LA. Yeah.
And yeah, I think a lot of American filmmakers in particular, but also I think just like even developers, they are not particularly self-reflective. They don't like to look at the trouble within necessarily, in a way that I think European directors often do. I think a lot of English directors do that. They like so much of British cinema is deeply about the awful systems that are at play and have been at play for decades now within our country, in the way that people are treated by the various governments that we've had. And I think European cinema can be very emotive, and so I think because we see so many Europeans influenced by Lynch's work, because it falls in line with so much other European work, it becomes a thing they grow up with. Like, was I think Inland Empire, because I think that was funded by Studio Canal, which I believe is a French production company.
Yeah, it is. And another kind of fact to insert there quickly is that most of Lynch's projects, I think after Twin Peaks, pretty much only took off because of European, mainly French funding. He kind of became a pariah in Hollywood somehow. After, I don't know if you guys know about how hated Fire Walk With Me was, but after that point, like it was, I think after that point, it was incredibly hard for him to get American funding.
Yeah, he just stopped becoming like a bankable director, right? And I mean, that's what Hollywood cares about.
Yeah. But I think because like he, again, kind of going back to that point of the self-reflection within his work, I wonder if that love of Americana that he has, that's more present within Twin Peaks, is he thought about it a bit more, and again kind of presented it in a new light, and the discomfort he found within it within his later works, within works again like Lost Highway, within Mulholland Drive, which have very particular presentations of Americana, the kind of like seedy underbelly you don't really get to see. It's not all glitzy and glamorous. And again, I think like a lot of European cinema is not particularly glamorous because it didn't have Hollywood as a institutional place to come up in, which is all about that, like the celebrity status and the red carpets and the stars across Hollywood Boulevard and things like that. Like the culture is just completely different, and Lynch just didn't. He did Elephant Man, and then he did Dune, and was like, that fucking sucked. I'm not doing a studio movie again. Yeah,
and I guess like Mulholland Drive in a lot of ways, in particular with that director character Adam, is, if we're looking for the David Lynches in the David Lynch movies, I think Adam is the David Lynch in Mulholland Drive in a lot of ways, because his plot about being a director that wants to have control over his own like art, and not being able to have that control like within the Hollywood system, feels a lot of people have read that as being very reflective of Lynch's experiences with Hollywood. But yeah, it's so when we look at a few of these game studios, we got French, Japanese, and one Estonian studio that comes to mind, but France and Japan, there seems to be a lot of love for David Lynch in those places. And it would be an interesting one to think about a little bit more, because I was thinking about what you said, Fia, and I was like, I mean, me personally, I don't know, I might have a slightly different opinion of European cinema, but I can't really like put words to it right now. But what I would say is that I think that, you know, Hollywood, like the American empire, American imperialism controls a huge amount of the world at this point. So much of us outside of America are consuming American culture and have an idea of America in our heads that is very clear. And so I think that puts, like, you know, artists outside of America critiquing America in quite an interesting position, because sometimes I think perhaps non-Americans can kind of like access that in a particular way. And I think there are like many examples of that. But it's almost like American imperialism creates like a double consciousness. So for anyone who doesn't know, double consciousness is a term coined by W.E.B. Du Bois in particular relation to the subjectivity of black people, which is that black people are kind of form identities in the world, both as these kind of othered, racialized subjects, and as people who have access to kind of a unique understanding of whiteness that white people themselves don't really understand. Because of our, sorry, I'm not black, but I am a person of color, because of our exclusion from it, it's like we're kind of able to both be have access to both of those kind of consciousness, black consciousness and white consciousness, if that makes sense. So I don't know, in a way American imperialism generates that, because it's like for non-Americans it's like, well, we have such an understanding of the idea of America and the kind of like ins and outs and the trappings of that. But equally, is it sometimes a cop-out to create art as a French person or a Japanese person about the dark underbelly of American suburbia, but not put the mirror to your own culture, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Something I was going to say as well is that I do sometimes feel like David Lynch's obsession with Americana almost is like touristy. It's almost like, and I guess I think of it in terms of like Dale Cooper being an outsider coming to the Pacific Northwest, coming to Twin Peaks and like loving everything about this small town, but it's like it does feel like an outsider looking in. And again, maybe that is where some part of like other cultures kind of really love that attitude, because it's like, yeah, we are on the outside looking in, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, just a thought.
I feel like that's interesting. I have to think about that a little bit, because that's a really interesting point of view. But Silent Hill F, I feel like it occupies a really interesting place now that we're having this conversation, because every previous installment of Silent Hill is set in America, and this is the first one that's been set in Japan, and of course famously it's a Japanese developed series. So I know that Fia's played it already. I'm super excited to play it, because I'm like, okay, what does the Silent Hill treatment, which is the psychological horror that explores all of these themes, some of which are like relevant to kind of Americanness, what does that look like when they, again, I guess like I was saying, like put the mirror to Japan? Whereas on the flip side, like I think about Don't Nod, for example, and specifically the team on Life is Strange, and I'm like, I love these games, but why are you always making games set in America?
Yeah, there's so much to say about France.
I feel like I can speak to that slightly.
Go on.
I think it's literally just a commercial thing. Like I think it is a pure thing of like thinking, because games are in a lot of cases an export for most companies. They have to have broad appeal, and again, that like American imperialism thing, America has a broad appeal because everyone knows about it, everyone is conscious of it, everyone consumes its media.
Good point.
And like I do think that more artists from different countries should be holding up a mirror to critique their own culture and the way that it operates, but it's so difficult to do that as an artist when you're also trying to make money.
It's a good point, yeah.
Like, you know, Alan Wake wouldn't have been, you know, it's not that Alan Wake is a massively successful game. I do believe it's like broken even. I don't know if it's turned a profit. That might have changed since the last time they've kind of spoken on that. But like it took a little bit of time to break even. Like, you know, Remedy are very beloved, but they are not massively financially successful compared to other game studios. But they clearly like are still operating at a level where they can continue to do pretty much whatever they want to do. It's quite rare. But that doesn't mean that like Finland is a sellable like video game setting for them. I think there are very few game studios that could set a game wherever they want to. I think Kojima's kind of interesting in that sense, where like, yes, Death Stranding, the first one, is set in America, but really actually it's kind of set in like Iceland, because geographically it looks nothing like America. And you're still being sold the idea of America because of how much it is just in the narrative of the game, and the presence of actors. But even then, like, you have Lee Sedol in one of the main roles. You have a French actress there, because of Kojima's love of cinema. So like, he is someone that can kind of get away with doing what he wants, but is also obsessed with America to a certain point. And Death Stranding 2 is in Australia, which is unusual for a game as well. Like, I can't think of any other games that are set in Australia other than the Mad Max game, maybe. But commercially, it's so difficult to sell anything that people aren't already familiar with. It's why, even just within genres, that like roguelikes are really popular at the moment. Games that have like a repetitive quality to them. It's, if there was a freedom to make any kind of art you want without having to worry about making money off of it, I think we would see that. I would hope that we would see that more. I think we would see that more. But I think that's kind of the biggest barrier to artists in the game scene compared to other artistic professions and vocations.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the kind of particular interest in like Scandi noir that happened a few years ago, and like how suddenly like there were these just massive like exports of TV shows and films and stuff from like, you know, Norway and Sweden and Switzerland, and, you know, this kind of idea of this like Finland, like this idea of this like cold grey kind of environment, and like usually obviously it was always like, yeah, noir, like crime, you know, fit these very specific tropes, but it just became this like random trend where everyone was obsessed with watching them, and then they just kind of went away. But I wonder if that would ever happen for video games. Like, would that ever suddenly be a thing? And I can't especially not with subtitles. I definitely couldn't see it happening. But it is interesting, isn't it, how these like almost became like a trend, and it was like suddenly everyone wanted to read subtitles out of nowhere.
It's a really great point.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that like it works for television, and I think it's why like K-dramas are so exportable, is that like they are popular within their home countries as a starting point.
Yeah.
Whereas games don't work that way. You don't generally have games that need to be popular in their home countries first. Japan is different in that sense. Like the target demographic for most Japanese studios is still Japanese people.
Yeah.
It's the same with Chinese studios. It's the same with Korean studios. You're seeing a lot more like Korean and Chinese studios trying to broaden who they're appealing to now with things like Black Myth Wukong, and a lot of different gacha games and stuff. They're all like Chinese and Korean developed. But there is just not.
Sorry, I was going to say, it's interesting though. I do, like, even so, I think that like there's certain things that come to mind about, like, I would need to fact check this. You might know this better than me, but I remember hearing that like part of the reason why Silent Hill was set in America was because of kind of Konami wanting to appeal to an American market and kind of wanting the next, like, a Resident Evil type for their portfolio. I don't know how true that is, but I did hear that. And
I believe that to be the case as well.
Something that also came to mind is that, so I've been playing PlayStation since I was a kid, not news to anyone who follows the channel, but I learned the other day that the button mapping on the PlayStation has been different in Japan to the rest of the world for most of its history, but with the release of the PS5, Sony tried to put the kind of like American-based mapping to their Japanese audience, so they tried to kind of create a universal button mapping based on the American market. So they wanted to universalize it, but the Japanese audience hated it, so they had to reverse it.
I mean,
Yeah, I'm
you
not
would.
surprised.
Yeah, I'd be mad.
Yeah, I'd be mad too. But
You
it's
find that in
so
some-
even then, it's like the American market, it has a chokehold everywhere. And yeah, it does kind of come down to, you both make great points. I feel like the kind of material context of like American like imperialism, like cultural imperialism and global capitalism has a lot to do with it, yeah.
It's
Otherwise,
difficult.
maybe we would have gotten a Life is Strange game in France. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like you can kind of. An interesting point on that is how, again, when we're thinking of target demographics, is like Chernobyl, the show, which is set in Chernobyl, and except everyone in it is English and has English accents. And I think an interesting parallel to that, which is not particularly Lynchian, but is like A Plague Tale: Innocence, which is set in like, I don't know, whenever the plague was in France, you know, like 11th century, 14th century.
You know, they
something
had
like
that plague thing, yeah.
Yeah, I you know, it's France.
Yeah.
Who cares about France?
Eh.
But like, again, like the characters in that game, again, I think a French developed game. I'm not entirely sure. Don't hold me to it. But they're speaking English. Like, it may be in French accents, but you know, the actors themselves are not French. So we're just so beholden to English speaking territories that we can't see these, even just smaller studios most of the time, reflect upon the issues within their own society, and so we have to kind of like pull from American sources and then reflect and regurgitate American sources.
For sure. Hi friends, it's today, January the 15th of 2026. We recorded this, I think, back in October, just to give you a sense of how long it's taken me to get through editing. Tomorrow is the first anniversary of the death of David Lynch, and I think you can tell from the whole video that you've just watched that his impact on video games has been enormous. There is so much that we could have talked about. I think you know, we talked for 3 hours. I think that's roughly how long I've kept everything in for, because quite frankly we had a lot of good stuff. And I think that, you know, sometimes you don't have to edit yourself down for profit. We're not profiting, so we might as well say it all, you know. But yeah, I think it's clear that we, you know, each, like me, Fia, Sarah, in our own ways, have all been impacted by his work, whether, you know, knowingly or unknowingly. You know, his references are everywhere in everything we do, and the things that he has changed. You know, there are so many influences, and there are so many people who are influenced by his work and attempt kind of their own versions of surrealism as a result, or try and evoke that mood or that impact. And of course, video games are a perfect place for that mood and impact to really affect us. And yeah, we've obviously mentioned quite a lot of different video games that have all had impacts on us as well throughout this video. And yeah, there's some good stuff, you know. If there's anything that you guys think about that we maybe didn't talk about, that, you know, maybe you have any thoughts on David Lynch's work and video games maybe we didn't mention, we would love to hear about them. Sarah's been doing some very Lynch-inspired games on our streaming channels, so that's kind of been part of our vague attempt at timing things at all. But I think it's partly as well just because we've been in that headspace since Lynch's death last year. Obviously, we also put some work into the little skits, so please do consider signing up to our Patreon if you have the funds. We are working on a little revamp at the moment of it. My colleague B has been doing some great work in that area, so we'll have some updates soon. I hope you guys had a nice time watching this as much as we had a great time chatting about it. And yeah, R.I.P. David Lynch, thank you for your contributions and your work and your flawed genius, because without that, I think most of the games that we at Game Assist love wouldn't exist. So yeah, thank you, and thank you for watching.